Okay, we're live. We have with us Alexander Mercouris in London, and the one and only Brian Berletic from the New Atlas is also joining us on this live stream. Hello, Brian. Hello, Alexander. How are you guys doing today?
Oh, doing great. Wonderful to have Brian on the show again, if I may say. He's doing outstanding work, Brian, on the New Atlas, if I could just say.
And likewise, I was just telling Alex, both Alex and Alexander do amazing work, especially regarding Ukraine. It allows me to focus on other things like here in Southeast Asia, because I mean, there really is no reason for me to do an update if the two of you have covered everything so expertly. So it's just easier to share your videos and then move on to something else. I think that's a great way for, I guess, the so-called alternative media to kind of to work together, cover more ground.
Well, we certainly should work together. But can I just say, Brian, just quickly, which is that we feed off you as well.
Absolutely. So let's answer questions that people have on their mind on this live stream. We'll go for about an hour 15 minutes, and I think Alexander, I think you're freezing up.
I think
Alexander.
He's frozen. Yeah, that's
yeah. He just sent me.
I think he's maintaining that
because connection lost. Let me throw him off here and okay. So we'll just answer some questions that people have. Brian, we'll wait for Alexander to jump back on. I know he's not in his home. You can tell from the background. And let's say hello to everyone first that is watching us on the Duran.locals.com, Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, Telegram, and of course YouTube. And hello to our moderators, Peter and Reckless Abandon and Zariel and myself. And I think that's everyone moderating for now, for the time being. So, Alan. Hey, Alan. How are you doing? All right. So let's get to some questions. We'll wait for Alexander to join us. Brian, when the spring-summer counteroffensive fails, how do you think Jean-Claude Van Damage Control Kirby, great nickname, how do you think Kirby will try to spin it as a Ukraine win?
I think we already see the beginnings of their strategy to do this. I think it's not going to completely fail. There will be some gains somewhere. And just as I think it was Lindsey Graham was saying, actually it was one of your more recent videos, Alex, where you covered him saying how great the plan was, but then when asked, are they going to take back all of Ukraine's territory by the end of the year, he said, well, no, we'll just make some small gains. I think that's what will happen, and I think that's how they'll sell it as an actual victory rather than as a failure.
Yeah. Commander Crossfire says, given everything we've seen so far in the conflict, are we learning more? Are we leaning more towards full annexation or just the 4 regions? Does Ukraine itself even factor in negotiations?
I think the last part first. No, I don't think that they do. This has all been, since 2014 onward, this has been an exercise in U.S. foreign policy executed through Ukraine and the proxy regime they installed into power. As far as full annexation of Ukraine, I don't think that that's what Russia is. Nobody knows what their plan is, but I don't think that that's their plan. It might go beyond the 4 regions, but we have to remember just fully capturing the territory of these 4 regions is going to be difficult in and of itself. And then to go up beyond that will also be difficult to annex all of Ukraine. I think that would be a very tall order, even with a full collapse of Ukrainian fighting capacity.
Yeah, I agree with that. Dominique says, U.S. senators increasingly looks like they're greedy and fat fellow of the falling Roman Empire. A lot of people compare this to Rome, that's for sure. And Tech Derb says, I like when Brian goes over Pentagon briefings. Thank you for that.
Yeah. They just had okay, Alexander's back.
Alexander's back. Alexander, from Sanjevo, why cannot South Africa just remove itself from the Rome Statute? What is the Constitution? What is the Constitution that the Supreme Court prevents legislator from removing itself from the Rome Statute?
I have absolutely no idea. I mean, I'm not an expert on South African constitutional law. I suspect, like many countries, that they made the big mistake of embedding membership of the Rome Statute in their constitution, or perhaps they wrote their constitution to say that South Africa would abide by the decisions of certain international tribunals, and through other laws, that makes the Rome Statute a part, in effect, of its constitutional law. By the way, the Russians made exactly the same mistake when they drew up their present constitution in the 1990s. They, in effect, incorporated the European Court of Human Rights into that constitution. So they had to change the constitution in order to basically disestablish the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights over their own domestic law. So I suspect that's basically the problem. But I'm not an expert on South African law, so there might be other explanations, but it's the most obvious one.
They lock you into the system,
They lock you into the system, exactly, yes.
Yeah, which is why a lot of people are asking, why is the European Union, why have they announced a fast track for the Balkan states to enter the EU and for Moldova? And we talked about this, Alexander, in a video. And Brian, a lot of people are asking this. Why are they in such a rush to get all these states into the EU or to get Serbia in? I'm like, they understand what's happening with BRICS and all of that stuff, and they want to lock these countries in.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it's about. Can I just make one, going back quickly to the South African issue? I mean, the South Africans drew up their constitution in the 90s, which is about the same time that the Russians drew up their constitution. And if you remember, there was big changes in both countries. The apartheid regime fell. Nelson Mandela came to power. The ANC came to power. Communism fell in Russia at the same time. And there was this enormous drive within these countries to adopt liberal norms to make their countries as close to that of what looked like the ascendant West at that time as possible. And the West obviously encouraged these processes, so they had to pass all these constitutional enactments and laws, and as I said, it locked them in. And with the EU, it's exactly the same. They're trying to herd all these countries as quickly as possible into the EU, again, to lock them in.
Yeah. Jack, thank you for that. Awesome. Super chat. And Frank Murr says, love your work, guys. Do you think Australia will pivot its direction or the way it blindly follows America if America collapses? We pulled out of the sub deal with Japan and France. What do you think, Alexander, Brian, on Australia?
Well, Brian, this is more your part of the world. But my own personal view is that I see absolutely no sign of South Australia pivoting or changing direction. I think the present government isn't going to change anything. Can I just say, now this is a bitter thing I'm going to say. I had a big argument before the elections in Australia with an Australian lawyer who told me that the way in which the Assange matter is going to be resolved is that you're going to get a new Labour government with Mr. Albanese, or I don't know how his name's pronounced, but I presume it's Albanese. He's going to become the new Prime Minister, and there'll be a deal done between Australia and the United States, and that will mean that Assange will plead guilty to some minor charge, and then he'll be released and allowed to go to Australia. And I said, this is delusional. It's not going to happen. You look at the political situation in Australia today, everybody follows the directions they get from Washington. That's the reality, and I don't see any sign of that changing. Now, Brian, as I said, this is more your part of the world. I mean, you're closer to these offences. I mean, the distances are enormous, but it plays more into the sort of China thing. I don't know what you think of this.
Actually, you're spot on. If you follow Australian news, it's absolutely toxic. They're pumping the public full of war propaganda to get ready for some sort of conflict that we can clearly see the U.S. engineering with China. And Australia is involved on an institutional level through their universities, through the media, obviously all backed by the government, but also the special interests that guide what the government does to meddle all along China's periphery, including here in Thailand, across all of Southeast Asia, and obviously much closer to Australia. We've seen news about Papua New Guinea and all of these situations. It's so deep. Institutionally, the U.S. has completely wrapped their tentacles around Australia. I cannot even imagine under what scenario things could turn around in Australia. It's the same for the United States itself. The special interests running the U.S. are so deeply ingrained in the system, but the whole system needs to be changed in order to affect change in the government itself. And I think it's even worse for Australia because it's by proxy. A lot of what is going on in Australia is done by proxy, and it depends on their sponsors to stay in power. And there really is no more independent institutions there in Australia.
Andrea says, as the old Soviet weapons run out in Ukraine, will the West send NATO weapons with operators and maintenance crew? Is there any way back from that? Or is that World War III confirmed?
Brian, this plays exactly to your strengths.
This is for you, Brian.
Yeah, so we could already see that Ukraine is running out of their old Soviet-era equipment, including its air defense systems, which were actually better than any of the newer systems the West had, and much more numerous than any of the systems that the West had. The West is sending a lot of equipment. They claim that Ukrainians are operating it. If there are NATO operators on the ground there, they're trying to keep it a secret. And as long as they're doing that, I don't see how it could spiral into a World War III scenario. Russia will just be wiping out these NATO operators along with their Ukrainian counterparts, very similar to what they were doing in, say, Syria. There were a lot of US and UK special forces on the ground there, but they kept it a secret. And if they ended up getting wiped out, then it wouldn't escalate because they're not even talking about them being there. So as long as that's the case, I think we could count on it not escalating, at least not in that regard.
Can I just add something to this, which is that, of course, during the Cold War, it was the case that there were situations where the two superpowers were involved in sending people, their people, into combat situations where they engaged each other. Now, the most famous example is the Korean War, where Soviet pilots flew planes, MiG fighters, which had North Korean symbols. I mean, so that they were made to look like they were North Korean. And in Vietnam, during the second half of the Vietnam War, when the Soviet Union supplied surface-to-air missiles to Vietnam, obviously far cruder than the surface-to-air missiles that we see today, but nonetheless, they were advanced weapons at that time. We now know that Soviet advisors were involved in helping the Vietnamese operate those systems. Now, the United States knew that in both cases, but in order to prevent the situation escalating out of control, on both occasions, the superpowers basically agreed that they would keep this matter private to themselves. And the very same thing happened from the other side in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Again, there's no doubt at all. In fact, it's largely accepted that Western special forces were operating in Afghanistan. The Soviets were perfectly aware of that. They pretended otherwise. So this isn't unusual or unique to have people working like this. It would be much, much more dangerous if we start getting ground troops going into Ukraine openly as NATO troops. That would be an extremely dangerous escalation indeed. And of course, if you send in dribbles of people, operating the surface-to-air missiles, flying the planes, a couple of hundred people like that, you can conceal it. But if you start sending battalions of people or brigades or divisions, well, then that's a different matter. And then we are into World War III.
Yeah, good point. Alex K says, if you guys get Colonel McGregor on a live stream, I'll buy everything on the Duran shop. Maybe. Well, we have a lot of merch, Alex K. So we're trying, Alex, to get as many people as we can. It's work. It's a lot of work. Brian from Locals, what is your thought on the Thailand elections?
He's done a video.
I've done a couple of videos on this before and after the elections. That this is what I started focusing on when I first started geopolitics, covering it, writing about it, I would say around 2010. The US government is obviously deeply involved all along China's periphery. Southeast Asia is one of the central areas the US is focused on. They're involved in political interference all across Southeast Asia, including Thailand. So a lot of people say, well, Brian, why would the US be so obsessed with Thailand? They're not obsessed with just Thailand. They're obsessed with turning the entire region against China, just as they've turned Europe against Russia. It's the exact same process, using the exact same networks, the National Endowment for Democracy, private sector groups that are adjacent, like Open Society. They infiltrate a society, they take over the media, they start working on the education system, they create organizations that specialize in legal issues, and they just start creating a parallel system next to the indigenous independent institutions of that nation. And eventually it reaches critical mass where a client regime ends up in power, and they have this huge network supporting them. It's not just supporting a political party, it's this whole network that's supporting them. They've been working on this for many, many years here in Thailand, also in neighboring Myanmar, also in Malaysia, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Cambodia and Vietnam, though, have completely uprooted it. Cambodia especially, the US client regime that they wanted to install in power, they're now located either in prison cells in Cambodia or in Washington, D.C., physically located in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, Thailand, they tried to play this game where, and it may still work out, hard to tell, but they wanted to play this game where they stay in the middle. They don't want to pick sides, and they don't want to provoke the United States openly and directly. So they have been trying to ignore this interference. But as we can see, this government poised to get into power, there's still some hurdles they have to cross before they get into power. But even before getting into office, they've already pledged to back the United States and its so-called Burma Act, which is going to provide or is providing non-lethal aid to terrorists killing people all across Myanmar, which is right on Thailand's border. So this is something that I warned about back in 2021, that Myanmar could turn into the next Libya. The U.S. State Department was already talking about recognizing this ousted government in exile as the actual, recognize it as the actual government of Myanmar, just as they did in Libya, Syria. They tried to do this in Venezuela. They were working toward doing it with Myanmar. They just needed someone in the region to help back this plan. At the time, the Thai government refused to do so. Well, now there's a new Thai government coming in that is openly saying they will do this. So it's very troubling. It's going to create chaos across the entire region. It's going to put things back many years, if not decades. Obviously, this is all aimed at China. In Myanmar, there's Belt and Road Initiative projects that are being attacked by these US-backed militants. The incoming Thai government, by backing these militants, is basically backing a proxy war against China. China is Thailand's largest trade partner, source of tourism, investment, infrastructure projects, and even defense partner. All of their old US military equipment is being replaced by Chinese alternatives. And it is hugely beneficial. I've been here for a long time, since 2004, and I've seen the positive change. All of this is going to be given up. Just like, say, for Germany, regarding Russia, cutting its ties with Russia, and now look at the situation they're in. Well, this is what nations in Southeast Asia, including Thailand, now face following this general election.
Mm-hmm. Brian, what are your thoughts on Aung San Suu Kyi?
You can find videos of her literally in Washington, D.C. at the National Endowment for Democracy with Carl Gershman and Madeleine Albright getting awards from her. Her whole network over decades was built up by the U.S. Every single person in this now exiled government has some sort of NED project that has been funded by the U.S. government for years and years. Their so-called Minister of Foreign Affairs for this exiled government literally has her own page on the NED's website. So, she is a U.S. proxy. The military, whatever its flaws are, and there's many flaws, and I'm in contact with people in Myanmar who support the military but are very critical of the military. They were ousting a U.S. client regime that was undermining Myanmar's sovereignty, and that's why they ousted her, because the country, the constitution, the legal system was being overhauled. Aung San Suu Kyi literally had British and Australian citizens in her inner circle, essentially white men running the country, and she was just the figurehead. It's very troubling, and that's what they did in Myanmar. This is what they're doing in Thailand. This is what they tried to do in Cambodia. This is what they're doing in Malaysia, the whole region.
Can I just quickly add to that, of course, Britain, as the former colonial power in Myanmar, is very heavily involved. And of course, Aung San Suu Kyi has very strong links with people here in Britain. I mean, to an extreme degree. Can I just ask one thing, Brian, which I've heard, and I don't know whether this is true, but somebody told me that one of the major problems that the US would have with Burma, with Myanmar, is that the army there is actually extremely strong. I mean, it's a very, very well organized and very tough force. I mean, whatever its political weaknesses, I mean, it would be a difficult institution to take on in a battle. I mean, have you heard anything like this at all?
It is a formidable force. The problem is that, again, these people in Myanmar that support the military, their criticism is that there is corruption and it is disorganized to a certain extent. Because if it wasn't, they would have already asserted control. These rebel groups all along the borders of Myanmar, and there's multiple ethnic groups fighting. They fight the central government. They fight and kill each other. They fight and kill amongst themselves. They should have gotten this under control if they were better organized. But it's still a large military. They're well equipped. They get equipment from Russia and China. I think it would be a huge, huge undertaking to try to militarily overthrow them, even if the U.S. got involved directly, which I don't see how they would be able to. And so I think it's going to just be the U.S. more directly backing this terrorism that's spread across the country.
The Syrian and Libyan, the Syrian especially, plan, essentially.
Yes, exactly.
From locals, Dan Rock says, a question for Brian. What do you think of the gray zone's exposure of the NED Vice President of Communications that they recently released?
I actually haven't seen it yet. I want to see it. They do really good work at the gray zone, so I'm sure that it's worth checking out. But I just haven't had a chance to take a look at it. They have in the past uncovered many things that nobody else has seen. They unearth a lot of really good information. So I'm sure this is no exception. I look forward to looking into it.
Alexander, your thoughts?
So do I. Just to add to what Brian was saying there. Yeah. Okay,
Alexander, your thoughts on the gray zone once again? What happened in the UK at the airport? Was it London airport with their journalist?
Absolutely. It was. Yeah, absolutely. Kit Clarenberg, and
right.
I mean, it's astonishing. It is an astonishing business. By the way, if you went to the British media, I mean, you wouldn't know anything about it. It's hardly discussed here. But it's an incredible thing. I mean, he was basically at Luton Airport, and he was arrested, and I'm not sure why. I mean, I've not heard an explanation, a really cogent explanation as to why he was arrested and what's become of him or anything. It's something that is most odd. But I can tell you this, to the extent that we have an alternative media here in Britain, and it's not very developed, because you see, we're so dominated by the United States in all our types of media. Anyway, here it's caused amongst those kind of people a huge buzz. Everybody's asking, what does this mean? You know, why have they come after him? Why have they come after Kit? What is this all about? And what one worries is that they're going to bring up some unrelated charge on some completely unconnected matter to his journalism and try to silence him that way.
Jeez, incredible.
Because if you follow the gray zone, they have exposed and humiliated a lot of these people that want the public to take them seriously. And when you look behind the curtain, you see that there's no reason to, and they're very upset about that. And so we can see what they do to other entire nations. Why wouldn't they do this to a journalist they think they could make disappear?
Yes.
Absolutely. And they lecture other countries on journalists, and free speech, and human rights.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's a story. I don't know whether this is true, and I have to be here I have to make it clear that this is just a story. This is just a rumor that's circulating, but Craig Murray has published it, which is that in the Assange case, Assange is trying to appeal the decision to extradite him to the United States. So he's trying to appeal this to the High Court. Now, in order to get to the High Court, you have to get permission to appeal. Permission to appeal is usually granted or refused within about 2 or 3 months. We're now months beyond that. And the rumor is that they're going to leave that undecided until after the presidential election in the United States, so as not to cause embarrassment to Biden in the run-up to his election. Now, I want to stress again, I can't confirm. I mean, how can one ever confirm these stories? But if it is true, that is the most terrible thing I have ever heard in my life coming out of the judicial system in Britain. I mean, to keep a man in prison without charge in this kind of way, to delay his application for permission to appeal in that manner, I mean, that is astonishing.
Geez, the way they protect Biden, I've never seen it before in my life. The way they protect Biden. It's
I mean, again, let me.
It is a rumor. I know this is a rumor.
It is a rumor. Having said that, it is still extraordinary and unexplained why there is this enormous delay in deciding whether or not to grant him permission to appeal. I mean, in itself, it doesn't make sense. So, I mean, inevitably one wonders, and perhaps this is as good an explanation as any.
Alexander says, you should check what is going on in Bulgaria. It is a political circus with leaked recordings, political assassinations, protests, counter-protests, and so on. A lot of clown worlds in there.
Well, it certainly is. Alex, a lot going on in Bulgaria. I mean, I get to say straightforward. I mean, sentiments of the people in one direction, the political class, very much like the kind of political class that Brian was talking about, that emerges in places like Thailand over time, they have a completely different set of sentiments. And of course, you can't really, that creates, when divisions become that strong, that creates a kind of stasis in society, which is what we're seeing in Bulgaria. I don't know if you got anything to add, either Brian, Alex. I mean,
just that if you look at all of Europe, I mean, this is a trend where the U.S. and special interests in Europe, they work together for the political capture of Europe, and you see the individual governments of European nations making decisions that are clearly not in the best interest of the European people. They serve Washington, London, and Brussels only at the expense of the people living in Europe. Look at what Germany's doing. Look at what France is doing. Look at what all of these countries, and Bulgaria, obviously, feeding their armies and equipment and money into Ukraine in this proxy war, creating hostility, needless and pointless hostility with Russia. To what purpose? How is this benefiting people in Europe? That is the whole point of setting up proxy regimes everywhere. And I would say the EU is a regional bureaucracy that they just overlaid, and they just consolidate control over all of Europe through the EU. Makes it very hard for a nation to enjoy or even have any sort of sovereignty.
Yeah, I read a report the other day which said that around 70% of the people in Bulgaria actually support Russian President Vladimir Putin, like view him favorably. 70%. I don't know how accurate that report is, but it makes sense.
I mean, I should declare an interest here. My sister-in-law is Bulgarian, so it's a country that I have some experience about. I visited it. Well, there's two things to say. First of all, this is an Orthodox Slav country. They speak a language which is very close to Russian. There are very strong cultural connections, therefore. But of course, the other important thing to understand is that Bulgaria was liberated as a result, yes, of an independence struggle, but also the intervention of Russia. I mean, there's this huge war that happened in the 1870s, which of course hardly anybody outside Bulgaria and Russia knows anything about. But it was the war which resulted in the liberation of Bulgaria from the Ottomans, which had been a very harsh rule. And this is well remembered. It's something that is very much part of, the culture. You see this everywhere. So there's all these very tight interconnections between Bulgaria and Russia, trying to prize these two countries apart, trying to set them against each other, is of course going to be unpopular with many people.
Yeah.
And
Mark,
since the languages that they speak are so close, they have an understanding of what's going on in the war and in Ukraine, which is a lot more much more highly developed than you'll find in the West.
True. Mark Hewitt says, do you think DeSantis should keep as far away from Fox News as possible?
I'll just as an American, I will just say, and having followed U.S. presidential campaigns with a great disappointment for many, many years, DeSantis says certain things that are obviously appealing. He's got I'm going to stop the woke mind virus, which I think is the 2023 version of Drain the Swamp. But just remember how Draining the Swamp went. They say things that you can agree with, obviously, but are they actually going to do this when they get into office? And with DeSantis specifically, he's all on board for war with China, which is the centerpiece of the establishment's global agenda, is to stop China and reassert control over the world by encircling and containing Russia and China. So, I mean, where do people imagine that's going to go? And what difference does it make if he goes on Fox or anywhere else with this message? Unfortunately.
Yeah. Peter Jackson, is there concrete evidence that Ukraine forces were planning to invade Donbass? This is key for justification for the Russian invasion.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, we have. There was undoubtedly a big spike in shelling in Donbass. Not just a big spike, a massive spike in shelling in Donbass over the course of February. And the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which tends to be very sympathetic to the Western side of things, and some of whose monitors has subsequently been claimed by the Russians carried out, in effect, spying on behalf of Ukraine. Anyway, even they were reporting that the vast bulk of this shelling was coming from the Ukrainian side. So I think that is concrete evidence. I mean, you're asking for concrete evidence. Well, there it is. I mean, the OSCE reports, which are very detailed, provided.
And I just want to add that. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add that the United States overthrew the government in Georgia, put a client regime into power, pumped the country full of weapons, came in and trained Georgian military forces, and then in 2008. They attacked Russian forces, and then they did the same process in Ukraine from 2014 onward. They installed the client regime into power. They pumped it full of weapons, and on a much larger scale. And what is Russia supposed to do? Are they supposed to wait for a military that large, essentially the largest military in Europe? Are they supposed to wait for them to go into Crimea, go into the Donbass, or cross over into the rest of Russia? Are they supposed to wait for that, or can we all agree that the NATO was malicious for decades, and this wasn't just going to suddenly stop? This was their plan.
Yeah. If they had waited, say, another year or two, Alexander Bryan, that force in Donbass would have potentially moved east. And there you could have seen some sort of trouble in the Kremlin and perhaps some sort of regime change going on.
Absolutely.
It's possible that could have been the thinking there.
Well, absolutely. If there'd been a Ukrainian attack on Donbass in February 2022, I mean, it's difficult to say how long the fighting would have lasted if the Kremlin had not intervened. But if Russia had not intervened, eventually Ukraine would have overrun Donbass. I mean, there is a major preponderance of force on the Ukrainian side, and that would undoubtedly have triggered a major political crisis in Moscow. Bear in mind, the single event that started to undermine Milosevic's position in Yugoslavia was firstly the fact that the Serbs were driven out of Croatia, and the Ukrainians constantly harp on this operation, this successful operation to drive the Serbs out of Croatia. And Milosevic didn't intervene. And the fact that he did this deal over Kosovo, which allowed NATO peacekeepers to get into Kosovo. And that undermined support for him in Serbia itself and opened the route to the political crisis, which was then engineered by the West and which eventually brought him down. So it's essentially the same scenario with nuances and differences. But of course, that's the key point. If the Russians had simply sat on their hands and let Donbass be overrun, especially after Putin and other Russian officials had said that they would never let that happen, that would have undoubtedly created a major crisis in Moscow.
Yeah, good point. Sanjeva, if Russia would not be able to capture east of the Dnieper, then what does victory for Russia look like? Even if Russia captures the 4 states, Russian bordering states would be vulnerable to attacks. What do you guys think?
I think it's a really good question because it's very hard to imagine how this conflict is going to end in a way that whatever constitutes Russian territory is still not completely threatened by NATO. I think if they leave any part of Ukraine under NATO influence, it will constantly be a threat to the rest of Russia. So it's very hard to tell how this is going to end, what the Kremlin has in mind to end this. But we have to remember there's several clocks that are ticking, the US dollar, the rise of multipolarism. So maybe they're just trying to hold on to what they have now and let the clock time out for some other larger development. I'm interested to see what Alexander thinks.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, one mustn't assume that the Russians have a completely worked out plan about the outcome that they expect. I mean, this is a war, and sometimes as wars happen, war aims evolve with the circumstances. I think that when it started back in February 2022, they did think that they could come to a deal with the government in Ukraine. Now, I understand and accept that Medvedev is not always the most reliable person to express the opinions of the Russian authorities. I mean, he's clearly been given license to speak out and to talk in all kinds of ways. But he did say recently that the only way this thing can be resolved will be by a change of regime in Kiev. If the current regime in Kiev survives, he said this conflict could last for decades. So I suspect that in that at least, he's probably articulating an opinion which is probably gaining some currency in the Kremlin amongst the Russian leadership, that however exactly this war ends, it has to end with a change of power in Kiev. In other words, a change of power in Ukraine over who rules Ukraine. So maybe that is the Russian objective, and I suspect that as this war progresses and continues, that is what it will eventually become.
Why is Macron saying contradictory statements every week? From John. Because that's Macron.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you answered the question. I mean, he wants to please everybody. I mean, he went to Beijing. He met Xi Jinping. Gave this extraordinary interview on the flight back, in which he said, he was obviously starstruck with everything that Xi Jinping was saying, and he was talking relaying all the sort of ideas that Xi Jinping gave him, packaging them as if they were his own. And then a few weeks later, he turns up at the summit, the G7 summit, and he says, we must all unite against China because China is the great threat to us. And he's just done the same. He's now, I think, is it in Bratislava? He's made a speech there. It's full of all sorts of clever comments that Macron comes up with, that if this Ukrainian counteroffensive fails, then we must rethink our strategy. Well, what is so clever about that? I mean, isn't it a statement of the obvious? But anyway, you're then waiting to see, and this is always the case with Macron, what he's going to say beyond that. He says, we've got to recalibrate our strategy. And then nothing. and the reality with Macron, pay no attention to what he says. Look instead at what he does. Because ultimately, again, he always follows orders. One gets the sense that somewhere deep inside him, there's an inner Macron that says this is all nonsense. It's all going to fail. We're going to end up in disaster. But ultimately, he's never going to break away. And I think that's become absolutely obvious now.
Yeah. Commando Crossfire, given everything Ukraine is doing and saying at this point, why hasn't Russia declared an anti-terror op? Ukraine, a terror state. How Russia has a breaking point. Why is it still an SMO, Brian? Alexander?
I think it gives Russia more latitude. If they declare an anti-terror operation, okay, maybe that might open up some more options to them, but I think they can incrementally work their way toward those options anyway under the special military operation. If you declare it an anti-terror operation, you're kind of painting yourself into a certain corner, limiting your options, and also limiting the exit ramps that Ukraine and its Western backers might be able to use to get out of this conflict, if they ever decide that they want to. So I don't think that it's necessary per se. At least that's my take at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I thought last year that they might do this, that they might opt out of the SMO, declare something more radical, but they didn't. They're sticking with the SMO. And to be frank, I think it's working for them. It's also, and this is important, I mean, it's keeping people globally on side. And when I say globally, I mean, I in my last video, I discussed at some length the comments that Narendra Modi made at the G7 in Hiroshima. And his interactions with Zelensky. And you can see how, the Russians playing it steady, playing it step by step by step by step, keeps countries like India on side. And it wasn't clear to me until I read the Indian readouts what a difficult meeting Zelensky had with Modi. I mean, Modi's meeting with Zelensky was straightforwardly a rebuke by Modi to Zelensky. And I think that probably explains why Zelensky didn't want to meet Lula. He didn't want to have the same thing all over again a second time.
Rockfin, Stephen says, I'm Australian. Sadly, Brian and Alexander's analysis on Australian politics was exactly correct. I listened to our foreign minister speak in Parliament yesterday, and his speech was saturated with USA neocon doublespeak.
Unfortunately,
yes. Leslie from Local says, are the changes in representative government in the world part of the de-democratization the likes of Keir Starmer talks about?
Well, yes. I mean, Brian's already made the point. You have governments which do not govern for the people. Let me, go back to Abraham Lincoln, what he said in the Gettysburg Address: government of the people, by the people, for the people. If it's not for the people, by definition, it is not a democracy. So that's what we're seeing increasingly happening all over the world.
And I just want to add that Western-style democracy, as it's practiced today, is more of a system of control than it is of self-determination. So people look at the elections here in Thailand. First of all, Thailand did not say, hey, let's adopt Western-style democracy. Seems like the best way to run the country. No, it was imposed on them, as it is imposed on many nations around the globe. They're pressured into adopting the system. They're pressured into keeping it an open society. And by doing so, they leave their gate open and unguarded. So the US and its allies work their way into the system, and they control everything that is being done at the highest levels. And as Alexander says, it's not for the people, it's for Washington at the expense of the people. It's not even just ignoring the interests of the people. It is putting the burden of the cost of these policies on the people.
Yeah, Matless X says, how can Russia protect their pipelines going through Western Ukraine after the conflict if they don't go all the way to Poland?
Well, I think this is actually a non-issue now because, frankly, I think the Russians have decided some time ago that those pipelines are going to be turned off one way or the other before very long anyway. So, I mean, their gas isn't going to go to Europe. It's going to go to China and India and those sort of places where it's actually wanted and needed. So, I mean, they might have all sorts of good reasons to go to Poland, but protecting the pipelines isn't one of them.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
Good point. Tapato Matato says, can you talk about Cuba briefly? Will the growing relationship with Russia, with Russia dollarization, allow it to finally get from under the U.S. blockade? There was an interview from the president of Cuba the other day, I believe, Brian Alexander. He said some interesting things.
Yes. Brian?
Oh no, I will defer to you on this. I really don't follow.
I mean, I haven't myself been following this story very closely, but it is unquestionably the case that Russian-Cuban relations are warming up significantly, and of course, the Russians a short time ago said that they would supply Cuba with grain and oil. Cuba is experiencing oil shortages at the moment, or has been, and the Russians said that they would fill the gap and they would provide Ukraine with food. Sorry, not Ukraine, Cuba with food. And we've now had the restoration of direct flights from Russia to Cuba, which is, I think, a big thing. And Cuba is talking increasingly about adopting the Mir card. Of course, the Mir card is useful for Cuba because Cuba has never had its banks connected to the SWIFT system, so I understand, because of the US embargo. And of course, MasterCard and Visa card don't work in Cuba, so I believe. So of course, this gives Cuba an opportunity to modernize its banking system and to integrate it with what is now an alternative emerging banking system, financial system as well. Bear in mind, there's just been a report today that Russian banks are now linking up to China's SWIFT alternative as well. So all of these things are beginning to sort of come together. So yes, you could see how Cuba could theoretically circumvent the blockade. I mean, they could go back to a situation not so dissimilar in some ways from what they had before during the Cold War, where obviously they're under enormous pressure. I mean, that pressure won't go away, but they're no longer isolated or so exposed in dealing with it. And perhaps the Cuban economy could start to develop in, more sustainable way than it has been able to do for some time now. So yes, this is an evolving thing. I think the Russians are keen to do it. I mean, they have warm feelings towards Cuba, which transcend, by the way, political issues. And beyond that, the Russians have also spoken of Cuba as a stepping stone. Establish your businesses, your companies in Cuba, Russian companies, Russian businesses. You've got all the connections, you've got all the links, you've got the banking system there working for you, and you can use that in order to enlarge your economic contacts, your commercial contacts with the rest of Latin America. But this is the Russians. I mean, the Russians can do a lot for Cuba, but of course, ultimately, I suspect the big money, when it comes, is going to come from China. And what often happens is the Russians go in first and then the Chinese follow.
Yeah, good point. Is DeSantis a deep state actor? What do you think? From John. Brian,
I mean, people should just
is he deep state?
They should just ask themselves if this is going to be the first time in American political history where someone says something and then actually comes through and does it. Do people, and then look at what he says about China and some other issues where he is consistently in tune with the U.S. establishment. Do people really think that this is going to be the first time ever? Oh yeah, this person not only is he somehow able to campaign and get involved in any of this, as an outsider of the deep state, but he's going to win and change everything. I think it's unrealistic. I think if he was a real outsider of the deep state, he wouldn't even be anywhere near the elections. He would be in a political and media black hole where no sound or light could escape.
Yeah. Divine Insurgent said, I remember a political science class in higher education I took called International Relations. Would you say that this is one in the same as geopolitics?
Well, no, actually. I mean, international relations, whatever it was before, has evolved into something completely different. I should say that a member of my family took an international relations degree. And as a result, I got very, very familiar with what international relations degrees are all about nowadays. And they are essentially what Brian was talking about. They are about training people who are going to work in NGOs, the very kind of NGOs that Brian was talking about working in Thailand. It's a training center, a training system, and an indoctrination system for people who want to work in that kind of thing. It is absolutely not about diplomacy. We had on the Duran the former Austrian foreign minister, Karin Kniesel, and she actually made that very point. International relations, as it's studied today, and diplomacy have no connection whatsoever with each other. They inhabit entirely different worlds. They inhabit entirely different mindsets. And at the same time, it's not about geopolitics or about relations between countries in any true sense. It's, as I said, all about, as I said, things like conflict management, conflict control, evolution, those sort of things, which, as I said, you can clearly see what it's designed for. It very much based, by the way, on the assumptions of the neoliberal political order that we have today. So it's, and that's what it is.
Commander Crossfire says, here in Zimbabwe, the foreign ministry summoned the
No,
American ambassador.
Alex, Brian, what did you say something?
Oh, Brian. Yep. Yeah, go ahead, Brian, on international
Yeah, sorry.
relations.
There was like a lag. There was a lag.
Yeah.
There was a lag.
We hear you.
Yeah. I was just going to say a big problem that they have here in Thailand is that, say the government does open a government-funded media platform. It's called Thai PBS, but then everyone that gets hired there, they've all gone to the US or Europe to study. They come back locked into these political and professional networks. And then when they're reporting the news, they have this pressure on them to report it from a Western perspective rather than from the perspective of serving Thailand and the region's best interests. And this is a problem that nations have to solve. They need to create their own pipeline to create the human resources needed to run a proper state media platform that reflects the interests of that state rather than a clone, basically, of the BBC. I just thought that I would point that out as well.
I know it's an absolutely correct point. And as I said, when you read when you see the kind of essay questions, the teaching, the tutorial questions that go on in our IR degrees, you see exactly that it's exactly what Ryan is talking about. It's basically forming people to operate these kind of systems that you see in these countries.
Yeah,
and just so people know, the candidate for prime minister that wants to be prime minister here, Harvard, MIT business school graduate. They're head of foreign policy, Harvard and Georgetown for foreign service. So that just to lay it out how obvious it is.
Georgetown University is the center of IR studies. Just to say,
it is. Yeah, it is. And Harvard and Georgetown. It's always from Harvard. Yeah. Commando Crossfire. Here in Zimbabwe, the foreign ministry summoned the American ambassador for election interference. Might as well reprimand water for being wet. Well said. Elza says, Gazprom discovered a new gas field in Bangladesh. Will that make a change for the country and region? We don't hear much about Bangladesh.
I don't know much about Bangladesh, Brian, but of course it is to some extent not unconnected to the world that you've been talking about, Myanmar
Well,
and Thailand.
Jeff
I don't know
Rich
whether you
from
have any thoughts.
Locals. Jeff Rich from
Yes, go.
Locals says Modi's comment about Bangladesh is also a rebuke to Western approach to handling new nations formed after the disintegration of the British Empire, India, Pakistan
Abs-
partition, 1947 Soviet Union collapse, 1991.
Absolutely. Can I just say something? I mean, Modi, I understand. I did not. It took me some time to get on top of this, but apparently he left the G7 with the leaders there absolutely seething. I mean, they were furious with him, both about what he said, not just about Bangladesh, but about all kinds of other things. And when you actually look at his speeches, you can see why. And of course, Zelensky was apparently deeply upset and angry with what Modi said. I mean, Modi said briefly, as far as I'm concerned, the war is not a political or economic question. It's a humanitarian one. So political one, it's not a political question. I am not aligning with you. This isn't going to affect my political position. And it's not an economic question. So I'm not going to impose sanctions either. It is a humanitarian one. And you must seek a solution through diplomacy, through negotiations, and do so at once and now. And I'm not going to help you with your war. I want you to see it settled. And he also basically criticized the whole idea, conception behind Western foreign policy. Said, why are we here in Hiroshima talking about international relations at all? Surely we ought to be doing this within the United Nations, within the framework of international law. And example he gave was India's relations with Bangladesh. And he said that, we don't accept unilateral actions by anybody, including, of course, by you. So, as I said, I understand the Western leaders were absolutely furious with him.
All
Anyway,
right.
Bangladesh.
Yeah. Did you have any comments on Bangladesh,
and
Brian?
gas and things like that? I mean, I know nothing about this story. I mean, I have to say.
When it comes to Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, it's very complicated, and I focus mainly on Southeast Asia, East Asia. That it's very complicated. If you look at, like, say, India's role with Myanmar, for example, because they do share a border, and there are militant groups that cross over the border. But then when you try to follow the money and the associations within the politics of India, it becomes extremely complicated, very difficult to draw conclusions. And I think this is a byproduct of British colonialism. Every place that they have been, they leave it utterly divided, and it's very difficult to make sense out of it. There's a lot of factors still in play even to this day regarding all of that.
Carl says, why does Alexander think it's okay to share extremely vague ideas from academics that won't give their name regarding Russia and had no option but to go into Ukraine?
I think there's a misunderstanding here because, of course, the person who sent me that information in a private email is about to have his article published. So he's going to come out publicly and he's going to explain exactly why he thinks what he does. And just to say, I put him in touch with Ray McGovern, and the two are busy arguing this thing through with each other, and I'm following on the sidelines of this of this argument. So I mean, I just wanted to say that because I'd invited people to respond to Ray McGovern's comments, and this person did give a very detailed and very substantive comment, which is going to be published very soon. So don't judge it until you see it. It's going to come out shortly, and then you can see it for yourself. I will say this: I still lean to Ray McGovern's position, but I'm not going to deny that there are other people who have different views.
Trevelyan says, it is such a pleasure listening to Daily Sense from you guys in this now mad Western world. Thank you for that. And Christian says, do you have any thoughts on Romania in this conflict? It's really difficult convincing people that the MSM is lying, given the fact that the MSM is reopening old historical wounds. Romania.
Alex, you've been to Romania, which I've never have been, by the way. But so would you have any thoughts about this?
Do you have any thoughts on Romania in this conflict? Well, Romania is very similar to Greece, I would say.
Yeah.
I think the population is, I won't say that they're pro Russia, like I believe the Greeks are more friendly towards Russians, but at least the Romanians that I've interacted with, for the most part, are not looking to pick a fight with Russia. They're not antagonistic toward Russia. There's obviously historical wounds there, but for the most part, I think the people in Romania don't want any business in this conflict. But the government is just a whole nother. So just a whole nother thing. It goes back to what we were saying from that earlier question. I mean, the government is one thing with Bulgaria, and the people are another. So
I completely agree.
Yeah.
I mean,
Romania is in that boat. It's in that boat. Yeah.
It's in there. But I mean, can I just say, I mean, I've had lots of interactions with Romanians. I've never visited the country. And my impression is that Romania as a country is going through the same process that Turkey did, which is that you have a country which historically had very strong grievances against Russia. Lots of the population were antagonistic to Russia, notwithstanding that there are also cultural overlaps. They're both Orthodox countries, for example. And yet, the experience of having to work with the West closely is changing people's feelings and shifting them towards, shall we say, a more understanding position of Russia than would have been the case before. But the elite in Romania is completely closed. It's another matter entirely. It does the same as every other EU elite does, apart from Hungary's. It follows orders.
Let's not forget that the Romanian elite, they also have deep ties to the Biden family.
Absolutely, yeah.
Biden family, Hunter Biden has done business in Romania. I mean, there are those connections. It's all the same in all of these countries in Europe. It's the same story. Just just copy and paste it. Mark Hewitt says, someone has told me that the background of Zaluzhny is a live movie. The flag of Bandera's party adopted by right sector. If that is the case, why have the Russians not made more of it? The flag from that video, that 30-second video, is the black and red flag in the background.
I mean, this is. We come back to the point about Gonzalo, and in fact, I mean, I think Brian's had issues with problems of this kind. The solution, he has never concealed his ideological beliefs. I mean, he's been going around. I mean, there's photographs of him wearing bracelets with a symbol of the crooked cross, which we all know what that means. And I mean, you're thinking, nobody should be surprised about this. I mean, these are the beliefs that Zaluzhny has. If he didn't have those beliefs, he wouldn't be commanding the Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, I can't put it more straightforwardly than that. I mean, he may be perhaps a less, shall we say, extreme about his beliefs than some people are, but they are pretty extreme beliefs.
Yeah, and where can you point a camera in Ukraine and not catch something like this in the background? I think Russia has made a big deal about this for many years.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know what more they can do. So I don't know.
Yeah. Anna Schumann says, Brian, you don't speak of India much. Your thoughts, please.
Well, like I said, it's a huge country, and to do it any justice, you have to spend a lot of time studying it. I mean, my general impression of India is it is a major player in the globe. It's an up and coming, if not already, a sort of superpower. Surely that has been made clear in this whole proxy war the U.S. is waging against Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of Indian influence over Thailand. Thailand is kind of like a crossroad between China and India. And so I have an affinity for Indian culture and history and food. But like I said, I focus on several areas wherever the U.S. is intervening militarily and politically, and also here in Southeast Asia. To then cover India would be a lot of extra work, and I don't want to talk about India unless I really know what I'm talking about. So that's the reason why.
Pavstajat says the West sending weapons to Ukraine, crossing red lines, Russia will remember, and the next war the West gets in, Iran/China, Russia will provide weapons, intel, and tech.
Well,
Yeah,
yes.
they already are.
They already are. Can I just make an observation here? I mean, and this actually flies off a video that Brian did some months ago, in which he made the actually completely correct point. We're all talking about this Russian winter offensive, and Brian said, "Well, I don't actually remember the Russians ever mentioning the fact that they were going to launch a winter offensive." And I went through all the things that I'd been reading over that time, and surprise, surprise, it turned out he was exactly right. And it's very much the same by these red lines that people talk about. The Russians, people always talk about the West crossing red lines in terms of the military equipment that the Russians say that they are not going to accept if it's supplied to Ukraine. I don't actually find that the Russians have ever said what kind of equipment, military equipment, they say that, that for them it would be a red line. Now, nuclear weapons, well, obviously. What they have said and what they did say right out at the outset of the war back in February was that direct involvement by the Western powers, that is a red line. If the Western powers go into Ukraine to fight the Russian army, that is a red line. And I think that is the red line we need to understand Russians have set. And for the rest, about all of those weapons that the West is supplying, well, Brian has discussed far better than I could ever do what the Russians are doing about those.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and again, we have to actually listen to what Russia is saying versus what the Western media is saying. And as far as these weapons coming into Ukraine, I mean, we're watching Russia neutralize them. We're watching NATO feed their inventory into Russian defenses. And that's what's unfolding here.
Yeah.
Ivasovic says, are any of you hearing, as I am, that Poland is 100% intent on deploying in the West Ukraine in the event of frontline collapse? Is Rump Ukraine too big to be Chechenized?
I would say this. I'm not quite sure about the second point, but about the first, I don't think it's. I think it's highly possible. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's 100% certain. I know that there is an awful lot of opposition to it within Poland itself, not least from the Polish military. So I'm not saying that's going to prevent it happening. I'm just saying that it's not 100% certain that it will. I don't know what Brian thinks about this.
I don't know about Poland going in. It seems like the next logical step after the U.S. is done using Ukraine as a proxy. Why not feed Poland and maybe even the Baltics into this proxy war next? And to do it in a way where NATO is not obligated under Article 5 to do anything at all about it. But as I always point out, even with Poland building its military up, which will take years to do, when it finally is built up, it will be about the same size as Ukraine's military when Russia began the special military operation in February 2022. So I don't know what they think they're going to achieve by this. It's not as if they're whittling down Russian military capabilities. They're building up their military industrial capacity. So I don't know where they think this is all going to end.
Yeah.
Matt Lisek says Central African Republic requesting a Russian military base. Also, I haven't heard much news coming from Sudan in the past week or so.
Nor have I about the second, actually. I understand the conflict, however, remains unresolved. I think that all sorts of countries in Africa are going to ask for Russian bases. Whether the Russians want to plant bases in these countries is a completely different matter. But you can understand why they might want bases, because, of course, the Russians or the Chinese have a base in a country that does provide you with some protection from, the other side coming in and trying to overthrow your government, trying a sort of operation against you of the kind that happened in Libya. The fact that the Russians were already there on the ground in Syria before the conflict there started undoubtedly did make a difference. Whether the Russians are keen to get drawn into places like the Central African Republic, that's a different matter.
I honestly think that Russia, China, organizations like BRICS and the SCO, I think they need to come up with some sort of global coalition to deal with U.S. meddling and help, instead of putting military bases everywhere, help arm these countries with the tools they need to expose and disable U.S. interference within their political system. If that was done in these countries, if they were helped to set up their own social media networks, set up their own English language media service to tell their side of the story to the world, to help them create a pipeline, to create the human resources needed to run their internal political affairs in the interest of their sovereignty, then the U.S. would be powerless. This interference would be powerless. I think that would be much better than planting military bases everywhere and then waiting for it to get so bad that you actually need to use that military power.
Absolutely.
Commander Crossfire, if you see the enormous footprint of U.S. and Europe have here in Africa, through almost every aspect of life and politics, Russia and China barely viable in comparison. Hard to see how Africa breaks free, but hope.
Absolutely. This is a very good point, by the way. And I mean, the Chinese and the Russians are very late comers in this game in Africa. They have a huge distance to travel before they can match the presence that the Americans, the British, and the French especially have established in Africa, which goes back all the way to the colonial era in the 19th century. They do have lots of friends in Africa, partly a legacy of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union supported African national liberation movements and gave a lot of education to African students. And of course, they do enjoy a lot of goodwill. And of course, the very scale of the American and European presence in Africa creates problems for the US and Europe in Africa, because of course the Africans know them and they know what they're about very well. But you're absolutely right, Commander Crossfire, you're making a very good point there. This is not going to be a situation where Africa can just break free like that.
Yeah. Sanjeva says the West's loathing is not just against Russia. Just saw Der Spiegel's racist cover of ridiculing Indian population growth with comparisons of overcrowded trains in India and posh Chinese trains.
Well, I already said that.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
I just wanted to they're just very angry with Mr. Modi. So not surprisingly, they're now going after India as well.
And these are all things that they always think about and want to say, but they don't, just for the benefit of keeping India subordinated and obedient. And now that they're not being obedient, now it's time to express all of this and really try to smear India. And I just want to explain to people that overcrowded Indian trains, this isn't because of overpopulation. It's just because of infrastructure and management. China has just as many people. And like they said, you look at their trains, it's night and day. India most certainly can do this. I think a lot of it is still the necessity of throwing off all of this baggage from the British Empire and really making something of their own there. And I think it's possible, and I think we will see it.
Yeah. Peter says, thoughts on Lindsey Graham quote, "Dead Russians, best money the U.S. has ever spent."
What is new about that? I mean, Lindsey Graham says all these things all the time. Maybe he didn't say it exactly like people have said, and I accept that there was editing done by the Ukrainians, incidentally, not the Russians. But Lindsey Graham has said appalling things like that many, many times. I am completely unsurprised by this. I don't even consider it news.
Yeah, I agree.
456123G says, thank you for all your hard work. The only solution, however, is to combine our global intelligence to seek righteousness, one standard for all, by setting aside the childish ways of us against them. The prophet's wife.
Yeah,
well said.
Thank you.
Commander Crossfire says, haven't seen any reaction to Indonesia dumping Visa and MasterCard. Any analysis on Indonesia and the dollar in the region, relations with China, Russia, and the U.S.?
Well, one can't cover everything all the time. I mean, this is where it becomes extremely difficult. Indonesia is, of course, a huge country, and again, it's more your part of the world, perhaps, in some ways than ours, Brian. But what I would say is, I think it is huge news, given that Indonesia is so big, and its economy is potentially so big, and of course, Indonesia has had a tormented history because there was the coup in Indonesia in 1965, an incredibly violent and brutal affair. There was the dictatorship that followed, which was pretty ruthless and backed by the United States. And Indonesia is now a country that is growing economically. It's cast off the dictatorship. It's becoming more self-confident. It's perhaps understandably taking steps to distance itself from its former tormentor. That's all I could say.
And additionally, it only makes sense for all of Southeast Asia to be primarily doing business with China, not only because it will be the largest economy in the world, but also because it's right here in the region. And not only that, there is thousands of years of mutual history between all of these countries. There are Chinese communities that have migrated to these countries generations ago. So it only makes sense. And also China is there in Indonesia building physical, tangible infrastructure that the West couldn't offer them even if they wanted to, but they don't even want to. And I think people are waking up to this. Surely, though, I'll just finish on this, that Indonesia will surely pay for doing that. And we should watch the news closely to see how the West is going to manifest this punishment that surely is going to come for doing that.
NGS says, will you have Defense Politics Asia as a guest? Yes, we are trying. We are trying. From Al Kovic, thoughts on the meeting South American countries in Brazil?
Well, it's another example of countries trying to come together to set themselves away from the US. Alex, go on.
No, I just want to make a real simple point on this, which is whatever happens with the de-dollarization or whether Brazil can do this or any country can pull this off, just the fact that they're mentioning it, I think is huge news.
Yes.
Remember, Gaddafi mentioned it and talked about it, and we saw what happened to him. But now you see a lot of countries are just talking about using their own currency, using their own debit card, using their own SWIFT. They're talking about these things, and they're confident. They feel secure.
Yes, they're
about these things. I think that's big news.
Yes. Brian?
In terms of, I think I agree with Alex. If you look at the vector sum of everything that's happening, you can see a very clear trend. The U.S. has been using military force to coerce nations into going along. And after a while, nations, I think they collectively realize they're being picked off one at a time. And if they don't do something about this, it's only a matter of time before they're all picked off. So I think we see this cooperation. It's also what the West is doing is unsustainable. So it's going to be unraveling. As it unravels, alternatives are going to come into view, and people are going to invest in it because it's clearly where the future is. Who wants to invest unless strong-armed to do so? Who wants to invest with the current unipolar world order? I can't even think of any rational reason to do so.
Yeah. Dan Rock says, what will happen first in Moldova? NATO and EU fully moving in, or people overthrowing Sandu?
I don't know.
Obviously, I hope the latter. If it was up to people, I see them more like the current Georgia than Ukraine.
I mean, exactly. I mean, I think this is an impossible thing because we don't know how it's going to play out. I think a lot is going to depend on the outcome of the conflict in Ukraine. I mean, if the Russians win, when the Russians win, if the Russians win, then I think you will see Moldova drawn away from the West back towards Russia. I mean, that seems to me the logic of it. If the West somehow achieves its objectives in Ukraine, which is looking less likely, but we must never underestimate what they could do, well, then Moldova will be pulled back definitively into the Western camp. The one thing I will say is that the West has landed itself with a leader in Maria Sandu, who is both, I gather, incompetent and disliked in Moldova by practically everybody, even many of the people who are or would be on her side.
But you know what, Alexander Bryan, she doesn't care. I mean, I've seen her in
No, I
media
understand.
appearances. I've seen her give speeches.
I know.
I really think she is the one leader, maybe even more so than Macron, that really
Yeah.
doesn't give a flying F
No.
if people hate her. I mean,
I
she
know.
really doesn't care. She's completely oblivious to it. She doesn't care. It's EU, NATO, all the way.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
It's really astonishing watching her, like watching
Yes.
her talk and, and give speeches and statements. She couldn't care if 100% of the country came out in front of her home and called her to leave office. She doesn't care. She's committed fully to
Oh, yes.
the EU, like fully.
Yes. Yeah.
Can anyone give a brief definition of union pay?
Union Pay is the Chinese
Do,
Visa MasterCard system.
do you have union
Now,
pay
I
in
mean,
Thailand? Brian? Sorry.
I think that there. I think they
Is
do
there,
have it.
is there in the
Yeah.
there's not in the
There.
UK, is there?
no, there's one bank which operates it, which is the Bank of China, which is not, by the way, to be confused with the National Bank of China, which is China's central bank. The Bank of China is a private bank based in Shanghai, which used to be the Chinese central bank before the current Chinese government, the communist government, came to power in 1949. But it is a Chinese bank, and you can get Union Pay cards there, and they operate the system in London. But that's the only place you can find it. When I went to Malaysia some years ago, you saw lots of places where you could use Union Pay cards. So, in Malaysia, the penetration was quite extensive.
Let's see here. David Jackson says, Alexander, it would be nice to see you visit Alex in Cyprus again.
Oh, yes.
Greece.
It's going to
Into
happen.
Greece.
Yes. Well, it's been to Greece, but I mean, Cyprus and Greece, absolutely, of course.
Sparky says, I think the SBU was abiding by whatever deal they made with Gonzalo, but the U.S. specifically requested that he be arrested the second time to keep him silent for the duration.
Who
knows?
Honestly, who can tell? Yeah, who can tell?
Yeah.
Because look at the Ukrainian government. Is there any rhyme or reason to anything that they do? And the answer is no.
Yeah, no.
I agree with you. Yeah. Bunzo Bubbles says, thanks for all you do. Is it possible the slow pace of the Russian pursuit will work against them as time goes on, since it is allowing more time for the West to organize more weapons and counteroffensives?
Brian?
Sure. I would just say, when you read the Western media, they will say, the growing Ukrainian military power that, the West is giving them. But then also the Western media is admitting to shortages of everything from artillery to air defense systems and the munitions that they use. So actually, when you follow everything very closely, you see that military power is waning. Even when they are sending more weapons, more munitions, it's not as much as they have been. And it's certainly not as much as Ukraine had on hand in February 2022. So, no, I think time is working in Russia's favor, and that is why they're going so slow. They could organize an offensive, a big arrow offensive. They'll lose lots of men, lots of equipment. They could do it. They have the manpower. They could do another mobilization. But why do that if you can just do it slowly like this? Preserve your fighting capacity. Be prepared for something that NATO might do unpredictably, and still achieve your goal without needlessly killing people. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, can I just say, Brian and I have discussed the question of shell and ammunition production. We now have had some figures about this from the US authorities. And the US says that in 2022, Russia produced 1.7 million shells. And apparently production rates have risen significantly in 2023. And the Pentagon, I think the US now expects Russia to produce something like 2.5 million shells in 2023. And that's still a rising number. Now, these are production figures which in the West we are simply not able to match. I think, what the Pentagon was talking about is around 200,000 shells Russia is producing a month this year. The US produces perhaps about 20,000. The EU produces about 14,000 shells. So who is getting stronger? I mean, it's exactly the point that Brian is making. And these are American figures.
Yes.
Danielle says, Australian war hero has been judged as a war criminal. The revelation of crimes are horrific and were committed on Afghan citizens. I was surprised that our legal system supported the investigative journalists.
Well, there are still some real judges around.
Raphael says, a corporal killed a general, second in command. Brian, just like me, we were Marines and sergeants. Why are we still calling Ukraine army an army?
I think it still has the basic characteristics of an army. Yes, obviously there are things taking place that you would not see in a well-organized, well-led army. It's only going to get worse over time. But it started out as more or less a well-organized modern military. It still has all of the characteristics. A lot of people say, isn't there going to be a point where everything just collapses all of a sudden? And I don't think so, because I think they still have a hierarchy. Yes, obviously, if you have subordinates killing their superiors, that is a major problem if that becomes an epidemic. But how often is that actually happening? I don't think we have any way to know, but I think we could see the general trend of the degradation of the Ukrainian military.
Yeah. Lotus Triangle says Union Pay is in Thailand. It is the debit card sponsor for Bangkok Bank. Interesting.
Yeah, I've seen the logo on many cards around here. So.
Law of Attraction says Bangladesh is under U.S. sanctions for nuclear projects with Rosatom. Was driving with Bangladesh Taxi in Dubai, and he told me the war is in Ukraine, but the fuel price went up 50% in Bangladesh. That's the global economy.
Modi made exactly that point again in Hiroshima. He said, you're obsessed about this war, but it's we who have to pay, and we are not in a position to pay because we're not as rich as you. And he said that's a fundamental reason why the war should end. And he also said that we have to have a system, a reworked international system in which the concerns of the global south are heeded. And that means giving the global south, including, of course, India, a much bigger role in the United Nations and in the Security Council. As I said, you can understand why Der Spiegel is now publishing pieces about overcrowded Indian trains. They were furious with it.
Freedom Gone 1984 says, new to Rumble, please help a like-minded streamer and follow or sub my channel. Freedom Gone 1984 on Rumble. Please like or follow her channel. Thank you.
Okay.
Freedom Gone 1984. And another Rumble question from Ken Media Reader. How has the West not silenced Viktor Orban after his continuously slamming liberal progressives and comparing them to the communists and the virus? Go Orban.
Not for want of trying is the answer. I mean, he's an extraordinarily tenacious leader, and he's obviously got a lot of support in Hungary, and I think that support is growing. But they're not going to give up. I mean, they'll keep hammering away at him. So don't assume that he's there.
They're not going to
forever.
give up.
Go on, Alex.
No, they're not going to give up. You're right. They're not going to give up on Orban. They're not going to give up on Erdogan. Me and Brian were talking before the show about Asia and what they're trying to do. They're not going to give up. They're going to continue to try and do their regime changes and their color revolutions and all that stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there was an extraordinary, since you brought up Erdogan, I mean, there was an extraordinary article about the election in The Guardian, which said that, this democratic victory of Erdogan in Turkey was not a manifestation of democracy. Work that out.
It never is unless they get the results they want, then it's absolutely democratic.
Yeah, exactly. Sparky says, Blinken's white man's burden, condescending style of diplomacy seems ineffective. Maybe he should double down or otherwise try harder.
I think he is doubling down on it, obviously, because he doesn't know what else to do. He's not equipped to do anything else.
Exactly. Matlis X says the Russian Beluga spy well bombed Nord Stream. Facts. Thank you for that.
No, I think it's a much more plausible story than the 6 guys.
Than the Andromeda, Zarael says, Alexander, what is it with the British arresting journalists from all over? Is the UK now a communist regime? If so, I fear to visit it ever again. Sheesh. You know, Zariel, I'll agree with you. I'm worried to visit the UK. I think a lot of people are starting to feel like this.
Yeah.
No, I
Like a
wouldn't
lot.
visit the
Like
UK.
I think this is going to really affect the UK. Yeah.
Yes, it is going to affect the UK. And I mean, I think we are absolutely on a slide. I mean, bear in mind, and I've said this already many times, the economic conditions in Britain are very poor. And I mean, we have a political system that is completely log jammed. It's not able to respond to these problems, and it is becoming insecure and also more dependent all the time on its friends in Washington. So all of this is making for a very, very unhealthy situation.
Peter Aurora Hodges says, did you see what the biggest TV station ARD in Germany posted on Instagram? Certain emojis are now considered extreme right-wing. I didn't see. Are those the emojis, Peter? Down below? The clown world, the sheep, stuff like that? I don't know. But German media is pretty rough.
German media is extremely tough and always has been, by the way.
Sparky says, smugnerant, a combination of smugness, arrogance, and ignorance, is a great one-word description of Western leaders and decision makers.
Yeah.
Cheddar Spinner says, thank you for all you do. Please, can you explain what is happening in Nigeria, having a drug lord for president?
I can't. I'm sorry. This is one country whose politics I'm not
Brian,
in any kind of position to discuss.
No, same with me. Nigeria is a very important country, has a huge population, has huge hydrocarbon reserves. It would be very well worth somebody's time to study Nigeria and actually many nations in Africa. I think this is going to be the next area that we see rise as the West's domination over the continent is challenged. But I don't know. But you could be sure that the U.S. is somehow involved. I know in the past I've seen examples of the U.S. interfering in Nigeria. You cannot have that many people, that much energy at stake, and the U.S. not somehow being involved. So that would be a good place to start. See who they're backing.
Yeah. Phil says, Brian, what do you know about the Institute for Strategic Dialogue?
That one's not ringing a bell. I'd have to look it up. I might have been one that I've seen that I'm familiar with, but they all have very similar names. That one just isn't ringing a bell. Yeah.
Exactly.
Says,
I mean, there are myriads of these things, institutes with all these kind of names.
Yes.
I mean, nearly all of them. Nearly all of them. I mean, I'm not saying this particular one, but nearly all of them are neocon mouthpieces. That's what I've always found.
Check an annual report, and usually somewhere buried, they will show you who's funding them. And if you see Lockheed, Boeing, or the State Department, that probably will answer your question.
Yeah. Sparky says, Brian, great worldwide work out of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
Triumph says, Macron is a Rothschild banker pick, and they are stuck in the middle of the war.
Well, he's completely out of his depth. He was an entirely establishment figure who pretended he was anti-establishment. He became president because of very complex electoral manipulations, backstairs manipulations that happened in Paris, which everybody in France, by the way, knows about and basically accepts and acknowledges happened. And he's not without some, intelligence, but he's extremely arrogant. He's out of his depth. He's got no real sense of the French people, and his loyalties are not ultimately to the people of France. It's as simple as this.
Alex K., is there anything the Biden administration could do to stall or postpone U.S. elections, like starting a war, if it was clear that they would lose?
I don't think so.
No.
We always hear this every election that comes up. People are always thinking, well, they're gonna do this and this so they can stay in power. The establishment doesn't actually care who's really in power. Maybe they would prefer Biden because it makes them more they don't feel like rewriting the narrative. They said he's going to do 8 years, so they want him to do 8 years. But I really don't think they're going to do anything drastic like that. Because the elections in the U.S. just don't work that way. At least from as far as I can tell.
I entirely agree. I mean, postponing an election is an admission of a crisis in the system, which might lead to questions about that system and might threaten its stability and legitimacy. So given that elections basically always result in the kind of outcome that you're comfortable with, why postpone them? The worst that can happen, the absolute worst thing that could happen, is that Donald Trump got reelected. I mean, that's the absolute worst thing. But Donald Trump was elected before, and they found a way to cope with it. So I'm not saying it'll be so easy next time, but they will probably say to themselves, well, we got through Trump before, we can get through Trump again. Let's not go to the extreme of risking a crisis by postponing an election, for which, by the way, I believe there's no constitutional basis. Remember, the United States had elections during both its Civil War and during the Second World War.
Patrick Nonstar says, is the U.S. out of options for an excuse to wage war on China? China is becoming increasingly popular, and the development speaks for itself.
I think the window of opportunity is long closed for the U.S. to wage a war against China and succeed, although they're not going, like we were saying, they're not going to stop trying. They're still attempting to set it up. They really don't have a justification. They're trying to provoke a war with China over the island province of Taiwan. They were just flying one of their reconnaissance planes less than 100 miles off the Chinese coast. Could you imagine if it was the other way around? And then they were complaining about Chinese warplanes intercepting it and just partially escorting it part of its journey. So they're going to try to do it this way. There is no justification to say, let's just start a war with China. They are going to attempt to provoke a conflict and then work their way from there.
Mr. Black says, start paying attention to Emirati banking and financial developments, decision-making to de-dollarize 203 trillion in USD-denominated holdings. TikTok.
Wow.
Very interesting. Golden Silence says, China and Russia have the minds of African. President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea was in China 2 weeks ago, now in Russia. I can't make out that icon, that emoji.
Africa,
to support
Africa,
the SMO.
I think it's Africa. Is it Africa?
Is it Africa? Okay.
Yeah, it's Africa.
Okay. The only in Africa to support the SMO.
Well, yes, but of course, I mean, he's, President Afwerki, Eritrea, has been very, very much in the Western bad boy class for a very, very long time. They really do not like him, and they really do not like the government in Eritrea because it does its own thing. And it's got good links with China, and it's had good links with Russia. So this isn't new. They've never liked him.
Alex, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you guys hear me?
Okay. Yes.
Have you guys seen the videos where Mexican cartels now have weapons originally sent to Ukraine that they probably bought on the black market?
They looked a lot like AT-4 anti-tank rockets to me, which is what the U.S. has been sending Ukraine.
Not a big surprise. I don't think this is shocking to anybody. Expected. It's buying all the Ukraine command a lot of homes around the world. These weapon sales. Rick F., have you all seen the Ukraine accusation of imminent Russian staged accident at Zaporozhye nuclear plant? Is the Ukraine laying groundwork for sabotage?
I think what they're doing is trying to create a narrative which would justify them taking control or trying to take control of of the power plant. That seems to be very much a focus at the moment. So they're saying, the Russians can't be trusted, so we got to put our own people in. And I think this is what this is all about, actually.
Yeah, I would say, Brian, my question would be to respond, Brian, as well. But I would imagine the ZNPP is a prime target for an offensive. If they're going to eventually do this offensive, I imagine the ZNPP would be their number one direction. I don't know.
I think that it is, and I think that they're floating this narrative because if something goes wrong and something gets damaged, if there's an accident while they're trying to take the facility, they want to be able to say ahead of time that, oh, this was the Russians planning to do this, has nothing to do with our reckless attempt to seize it by force. But that's what they've been doing for many months now. Anyway, I mean, the whole world can see this. So, again, I don't know who's going to fall for it, and I don't know what they think they'll achieve by doing this.
Sparky says, I still think that it's best for Russia to absorb all of Ukraine, thus leaving Western money collected for the rebuilding of Ukraine idle. Surely the money wouldn't be reallocated.
Well, it may very well come to that. I think this is just something we'll have to wait and see. It's possibly will come to that, but that's the future will tell us.
Sigrid Natalia Ramo says, I feel I am watching a race of WEF, WHO, pharma, war-financed reset. Thank you for that. Zoran says, as a Serbian, to many of us, it is clear that the current Kosovo situation is staged and is agreed between Vučić and Kurti. Has to do with protests taking Serbs from Kosovo, taking weapons, etc.
I mean, I don't know about this. My own comment, the only one comment I would make is that the Russian embassy in Belgrade, on the contrary, seems to think that this is not only real and serious, but that it's part of a color revolution attempt in Belgrade. And they've been saying that. And I did a live stream yesterday on locals, which is specific to locals. And a person from Serbia said the same thing, but also said that he didn't think the color revolution in Serbia would succeed because the great majority of people opposed it. But that's what I've actually heard.
Dan says, look forward to the Duran having RFK Jr.
Well, he might happen.
That would be great. Sparky says, also Russia absorbing all of Ukraine would leave nothing for a Bay of Pigs style Western-sponsored invasion force to invade, since invading Russia is too ludicrous even for Western fools.
Why is it too ludicrous even for Western fools? After all, they've been trying to do it over the last 24-hour periods. I mean, once upon a time, it would be considered too ludicrous. But I don't think there's anything that's too ludicrous to them now. That's my own personal view. But I think that there are so many issues and imponderables about Russia occupying the whole of Ukraine that I just said, I don't know whether that is the Russian plan. I doubt it is at the moment, actually. It might come to that. I don't think that's one of the reasons that, the Kremlin, people in the Kremlin are saying to each other. I think that, on the contrary, they could probably be saying to themselves, if we extend our borders all the way to the west in that kind of way, that will actually leave them more open to infiltration, especially as we might have a population in our rear that isn't friendly to us. So, there are all these difficult calculations to assess. And I mean, I don't know.
I would just say that if you look at a map, you have Belarus up top. If Russia takes it to a certain point, not all the way to a certain point, I think they're pretty well covered. I don't know if they have to go all the way.
All the way,
Because, you have Belarus, and especially if they get Transnistria, if they connect to Transnistria.
Yeah.
And I think they have a pretty nice buffer area.
Yes.
I don't know, just my thoughts there.
Yeah.
RDDR says, Brian, your thoughts on Marxist anti-imperialism?
Well, imperialism, I believe, is the highest form of injustice. I think everyone should be opposed to it. I don't think you need to be a Marxist, whatever that is by definition these days. There's a million definitions for all of these labels. I think everyone should be opposed to imperialism. And I avoid labels, and I avoid being left or right, because I look at all of these ideologies and ideas as a set of tools. And you wouldn't try to build a house just using a hammer. So why would you try to shape the world just using one perspective or one ideology? I think you should explore what they all have to offer and use them when appropriate, and use others when appropriate. And I think everybody can oppose imperialism, even if they have no ideology at all. They can just see that it's plain wrong to impose your will on not just another group of people, but an entire nation or section of the planet. It's just plain wrong, and we can all speak up against it.
From Rockfin, from Andres, Brian, why does it seem like the Baltic states are like a little brother that keeps picking a fight and expecting that the larger brother will be able to follow up with the fight? NATO is not strong now.
Well, I've just... Go on, Brian.
No, go ahead, Alan.
No, I've discussed... Go on.
Okay. I was just going to say, again, it goes back to what we were saying about the leadership being installed into power. That has absolutely nothing to do with what is in the best interest of those nations. And the United States and Eastern Europe have been using the National Endowment for Democracy openly, admittedly, over many, many years, overthrowing governments that wanted to try to balance between Russia and the West. That is unallowed. That's not allowed. You must pick a side, and that side must be the US, the EU, and NATO. And that is what they have done. They've transformed these societies and their institutions. The population is dragged, kicking and screaming. Part of the population will inevitably be indoctrinated and go along for the ride. And it really is. It's irrational. It's an irrational point of view. It's self-destructive. But that's how they've shaped that entire country. That's why it's so important for a nation to protect its institutions and its information space, to prevent their society from being poisoned like this in their minds and in their politics.
Well said. Alexander, did you want to add something?
No, I mean, what I just wanted to say is this. I've said this many times about the Baltic states. I'm just going to repeat it again. And this isn't contradicting Brian's comments. On the contrary, it confirms the point that what they're doing is contrary to their interests, because ultimately the United States is far away. It has all kinds of other problems. One day it might not be there, but Russia will be. So they are antagonizing the country closest to them, and they are relying unwisely on a country that is a whole continent and an ocean away. And that doesn't really make any good sense. The one country that can absolutely permanently guarantee the independence of the Baltic states is Russia. So if your concern is Baltic independence, then what you ought to be telling them is make friends with Russia. That's their true interest.
Gorillas in Indumfest says, do you think West's insistence on constantly escalating the war in Ukraine and regime change Putin as part of the broader Great Reset WEF agenda? Didn't the neocons try this in 1999 with Yeltsin?
Well, yes. I mean, I think I'm going to say this. There's the WEF. There are the neocons. They are not the same thing. I mean, there are overlaps. The two go along with each other on many things. Regime change in Russia has always seemed to me, first and foremost, an American geopolitical project, less a WEF one, which is a European one.
True. Agu says Zelensky's eyes are blue, and the man pretending to be Zelensky in the reappearance video has brown eyes. I checked multiple times. It's a body double.
Well, who knows? I mean, I think it is Zelensky, and I've heard it suggested that it's something to. I've heard about this thing with the eyes, that it might be something to do with the camera and the light. I'm not expert in these things. I don't personally place much weight on this, because at the end of the day, it's not Zelensky who's making the key decisions, and it's another thing I think we should say. I mean, clearly, he's an important general, but if he's no longer able to function, they'll simply replace him with someone else.
Zoran says, part 1 of 2 regarding Zaluzhny, crooked cross. Do you not understand it because you are not Slavic? There is a huge movement in all Slavic countries towards the old paganistic beliefs before Christianity. Zaluzhny wore these symbols and not an NAZI swastika. Yeah. Even a swastika is a positive symbol in our culture and represents our galaxy. It was deviated by the Germans, but it was actually a good symbol.
Well, maybe so, but of course today in Ukraine it is not. And I think we need to be absolutely clear about that. And if you're talking about Ukrainian neo-paganism, I mean, unfortunately, and this is the reality, it is very closely intertwined with these political movements whose ideologies are exactly what you would expect from people who go around with these kind of symbols. After all, he wasn't just, with the crooked cross. He's also had, the right sector flag. He's had Bandera's picture in the background. As I said, he's never made any secret of his beliefs.
Exactly. And was it a pre-Christian practice to name streets after Stepan Bandera? That's something else to do. That's real big in Ukraine right now.
Yeah, statues, streets. Yeah.
Yes.
Aloof Microbe says, I seem to recall that Big Surge has claimed recently that bringing up Ukraine's NAZI affiliations up with Westerners just seems futile now. Nobody really cares.
Yes, I think that is true.
Agree.
And I think it's one of the most alarming and frightening things about this whole affair. I mean, it astonishes me. Yeah.
Good media PR from the West. They buried that whole Azov, all of that stuff. They completely wiped it out.
Absolutely.
But yeah. And because they've done that and people have become so emotionally invested in Ukraine, when the evidence finally does come out, their ego, their identity is tied to supporting Ukraine. They would rather support this ideology even openly rather than admit that they were wrong. And they will try to justify it by saying, well, they're still better than the Russians, when quite clearly no.
Exactly. Yes. Sparky says, a person near enough to an explosion can get their bell rung without a mark on them. This could explain Zaluzhny seemingly in good nick, but perhaps a bit vacant or depressed in the video.
It's actually absolutely, a really good point.
It is a very good point, yeah.
Rafik Adams says, do you think Russia will occupy annex the remainder of Ukraine up to the Polish border? The West fails to enter realistic negotiations in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this question several times. Again, I don't know is the short answer. And to be frank, I think if you got Putin in front of you, sat him across you, and had a full and frank and free discussion with no possibility of leaks or anything like that, you would discover that he doesn't know himself. I don't think anybody yet can say exactly at what point at what physical point this war will end. I don't personally think Putin himself wants to go to the western border. He's previously spoken about Western Ukraine having been part of Poland and having been illegally taken from Poland by Stalin. And that might still be his view for all I know. But, that might evolve also. That might change too.
J.H. Scott says, thank you. As always, gentlemen, haven't heard much on Armenia and Azerbaijan lately.
We did do a program on it, on the Duran. There do seem to be steps being taken towards a peace there. And I hope that there is a peace, actually, even if it is a peace which is significantly less than the Armenians might have hoped for.
No placeholder. What are the Europeans doing in Africa is no game. What the Europeans are doing in Africa is no game.
No, that is absolutely true. And I apologize for using that word. But I mean, the point I was simply making is that the Russians and the Chinese have come to Africa much later than the Europeans did and the Americans did. And can I just point out, by the way, that if you're talking about the Russians, especially in Africa, but also the Chinese, well, it's a point they've been able to make. They were not part of the colonial enterprises of the 19th century. Russians didn't go and form colonies in Africa. In fact, the one country that they were close to in Africa in the 19th century and early 20th century was Ethiopia. And this was a relationship that was developed between the Tsar's government and Emperor Menelik. And it was an alliance. It was not a colony of the West.
Happy Zora says, thanks for being here. Also, thanks for your coverage during the week of the situation in Serbia. Thank you for that. Rafiq Adams says, to Brian's point about coalition versus military bases, is it more realistic to simply wait for the dollar system collapse and debt default and retreat of military expansion?
No, I think they still need, I think BRICS, the SCO, even ASEAN here in Southeast Asia, I think they should commit to a collective defense against Western interference, because a lot of damage can be done and it could take years, if not decades, to undo it once it's done. And there's no reason to not start this process now. It can be done. Countries here in Southeast Asia have already done it. There's no reason a collective effort, which would be much more effective, can't be pursued.
Sparky says, one of my brothers knew Ambassador Stevens on the phone before his death. He commented to me that Stevens was serious about helping African unity, maybe why the State Department allowed his death. Sparky also says establishment was able to get Trump to believe the Skripal poisoning and the Syrian gas attack hoax. They also got him to arrest Assange and assassinate Soleimani. Trump endorsed Romney, Graham, Governor Kemp, McCarthy, and McConnell. Has Trump learned? I hope so.
Well, possibly. I mean, but I think you're making an absolutely correct point. And given that story, yes, they don't want to see Trump reelected. They will move heaven and earth to stop it happening. But I suspect that they still calculate that if it happens, they can find ways around it.
Let's see here. God, I still have a lot of questions. My God. Peter Jackson, does the West need to be decolonized and the people who wish to use it as a bargaining chip for global control dislodged?
Well, what we need in the West is to finally put all this imperialism thing that we've been involved in and engaged in since the early modern era, the 16th, 17th century. We need to put it behind us and understand that it is fundamentally inconsistent with democracy, and focus on building up our democratic institutions and focusing on improving the lives of our own people. If we do that, then we have as good a future as people anywhere else in the world. But we need to stop thinking all the time that we have some kind of right to dominate others. It's unfortunately very hardwired into our thinking, and unfortunately it leads to all sorts of terrible consequences and results.
Rune says, USS General Ford is now touring the Norwegian coast. Any thoughts on militarization of northern areas? I believe once Sweden becomes NATO, blockade of northern seas will be put in place.
Well,
yeah. They're going to try, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Tom, for Alex, any updates on the cause of the Russian Cultural Center fire in Nicosia that happened in April? No. No updates, which is odd. Very odd. Sparky says, Putin sets a great example for the BRICS with his deal, with his a deal's a deal, honoring of contracts, keeping corruption at a level too low to halt progress.
Yeah. Yes.
Elza says, Zelensky is in Moldova discussing EU membership, but says that he might not come to NATO without a plan. Is it already that drop NATO for EU?
Well, possibly, but can I just make a point? I mean, a couple of days ago, Alex and I were saying that, Zelensky wasn't going to be in Kiev for very long. And here he is now in Moldova. I mean, he seems to be very keen to stay away from Kiev. But putting that aside, yes, I mean, it's understandable in some ways that he would be in Moldova. He clearly isn't happy that for the moment there's still obstacles towards Ukraine getting NATO membership. And it might very well be, as you say, that he won't get NATO, but he'll get the EU instead as a consolation prize.
Ideology says, why, Alex and Brian, don't you publicly support Andrew Tate, who is prosecuted due to his anti-war views? in friendship with Kadyrov. Why don't you pay attention?
Well, I could speak for myself. There's a whole segment on the internet deeply engaged in the so-called cultural war, and that is engineered specifically just to divide and distract everybody. So if people are investing into that, they are playing a part in dividing and destroying their own society. I have no time for that. I'm doing analysis. I put out my work. I'm a one-man show here. I record everything, edit, publish everything myself. I just don't have time for it, and I don't have an interest in digging through the cultural war, because I think it is just an engineered distraction.
Yeah. Ricey says what? Yeah, Alexander.
I agree with that.
Okay. Ricey says, what's Russia's economy going to be like in the future when all these other countries join BRICS?
Different. I mean, it's not always easy to predict things clearly, but I mean, if we do see an alternative trading system. I mean, if you go to Russia today, I mean, it may surprise people to say when we say this. It's actually already a pretty wealthy country. It's going to become a wealthier country. That's what it's going to be. It'll be less Western. You'll see fewer Western goods there. But there's plenty of goods made in Russia itself and in other places.
Jay Brulaham says, can you each discuss a likely alternative view of the future of China and Russia that isn't as optimistic as your current position?
That is a vast question. Impossible, it seems to me, to answer fully in a live stream. Yes, you can come up with multiple options and alternatives. I mean, the future is not cast in stone. It can't be. And things could go horribly wrong in both countries. Or they might take strange turns. But we can only deal with the trends that we see today, and these do seem to point pretty securely in a particular direction, and that's the only one that is profitable for us, I think, to discuss.
Brian?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, like you say, Alex, sometimes maybe Russia has everyone tricked. They really are at the end, and they've got Turkey and all these other nations lining up to support them, tricked, and that they're really at the edge of collapse. And everything that Gordon Chang has been talking about for decades about China collapsing in the next 30 days for the last 10 years, maybe he's right this time. So those are possible alternatives that aren't nearly as optimistic. But if you've gone to, I've never been to Russia, but I've been to China. If you go and you see the determination of the people there, I don't think there's anything that's going to stop them. It's just a personal feeling I have.
Yeah.
Vinicius says, thank you for all you do. Henry says, Brian, please go on the Jimmy Dore show.
Yeah.
If they invite me, sure. I would love to.
If Jimmy Dore is watching this live stream, please invite Brian. Yeah, absolutely. Matt Lisek says, Ukrainian nationalists today and years to come will embrace the terrorist tactics of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Russia, Europe, and the U.S.
Well, there was a rather strange article which appeared. I can't remember where exactly, about how Ukraine's military is actually copying ISIS tactics used by ISIS. So, we're not that far away from that point already.
It was on Zero Hedge, I think. Yeah.
Zero Hedge.
Jay Rillo says, after the war is over, will the absorption of Ukraine territory populace serve as a boon to fix the Russian birth crisis? If not, then what will?
I think the Russian birth crisis needs to be understood in context. We have a European birth crisis, and the Russian one is less bad. That may come as a surprise to people, but that is the truth. In fact, the Russian birth rate has gone up and down, and it's still below replacement, but it's not as bad as it is now in many European countries. I don't think what happens in Ukraine is going to have much bearing on this, actually. I think what will decide things is how Russia itself develops. And if they continue to pursue family-friendly policies and strengthen their economy, then you could certainly see the birth rate rise, as it has already done, just as you're seeing life expectancy grow.
Otnosen says, you're wrong about Moldova. There's no political opposition, and the EUization is well on the way. Youngsters are westernized. Romania is well viewed. Sandu is just a thin layer. Changes are deep.
Well, I hear that, yeah.
Mehdi, in the end, where will justice come from? All human rights violations perpetrated by the West? Is this part of the reason why BRICS was formed, due to the US owning the UN?
I don't think the US owns the UN. In fact, I think the US would like to own the UN, but it gets very frustrated by the fact that it can't control the Security Council because China and Russia have their vetoes. They do control many of the bureaucratic agencies that make up the UN Secretariat, and they're able most of the time to get the votes that they want in the General Assembly. But they've never been able to establish a complete control of the organization, as I said, because China and Russia are permanent members and they do have the veto power. Now, I don't think the BRICS was set up as an alternative to the UN. The whole point of the BRICS is that they want to refocus international law on the UN. They want to recenter things on the UN within a context of UN reform. The country that has been trying to bypass or get around the UN in recent years has been the United States through its so-called League of Democracies. It's had this attempt to get countries together in this sort of league. It's invited all sorts of strange countries to join. And that has seemed to me like some kind of an attempt to set up an alternative UN. But that doesn't seem to be going very well either.
Roger Zen says, Chinese foreign minister recently said Okinawa doesn't belong to Japan. How do you see this develop, and what are the potential geopolitical implications?
Did he really say that? Because I have to say, I haven't seen it anywhere.
And I think we would have heard a big outcry if they did say that. But the history of Okinawa is kind of complicated if anyone looks into it.
Yeah. ZC, thank you for that. Does MAD deter sociopaths?
Well,
no. What is keeping Russia, China, and North Korea from further developing economic, political, and military ties with the growing hostility of Japan and South Korea, North Korea S-500s?
Well, a couple of years ago, it seems like an age now, but it was only a few years ago, both China and Russia were agreeing to sanctions on North Korea. And I think they bitterly regret now having done that. But these are UN sanctions, so they can't be easily lifted and circumvented. And that does affect their ability to conduct trade, even economic relations with North Korea, let alone military ties. But I saw a comment by the Russian ambassador to North Korea recently, in which he said that they are looking at ways of improving economic ties with North Korea, even getting around the sanctions. And he said that there are means to do that. And that's probably what we're going to see. And I think the Chinese will do that to an even greater extent, actually.
Raphael says, guys, do you know about the 7-day plan Russia has to end any conflict in Europe? They presented it to the West and is how Georgia war ended.
I don't think there was.
Brian,
I've never heard of such a 7-day plan. I'm sure I haven't heard it.
David Hart, any truth to the rumor that the Russian spy whale was dropped into the water from a Chinese spy balloon? Let's see.
I'm sure it's absolutely true. It seems to me, it seems to me absolutely the most plausible explanation of all, by far.
To the panel, are you aware of the U.S. occupation of Haiti recently and the alleged presence of massive iridium deposits? Connection?
Well, I'm sure there is a connection, but I didn't know that there was a U.S. occupation of Haiti. This must be, if it's a new thing, then it must be the latest in a long succession of these U.S. occupations. I know that the people of Haiti don't want to see the U.S. in that country, and this has been a long-running thing for many years.
Alkovic, thoughts on Chinese refusing contacts between its military and U.S. until sanctions are dropped from one of the generals, which the U.S. enacted in 2019?
It's not one of the generals, it's the defense minister. Brian, any thoughts about this?
Well, I mean, it's just common sense. Why should China meet with the U.S. if they're going to put their Minister of Defense on some sanctions lists, some trumped up accusation? Oh, they're buying weapons from Russia, as if the West isn't doing something comparable or many times worse. And so, China doesn't need to talk to the U.S. The U.S. needs to talk to China, and it's up to the U.S. If they want to treat other nations as equals, they'll find their future much easier. And if they don't want to, they're going to find that it becomes more and more difficult.
Guys, how much time do you guys have, Brian? I know we've kept you for a while now.
I'm fine.
You're fine
until
Okay,
like another
good,
2
good.
hours. I got to go on Danny Hyphen's show.
Oh, Dan. Oh, cool. Very
Cool.
cool. Matt Lisek says, on the one hand, the U.S. and NATO ignored the UN Security Council in 1999 bombing of Serbia, but then go to the UN Security Council afterwards, UNSC Resolution 1244, to establish peacekeepers in Kosovo.
Well, absolutely. But this is again an earlier period in diplomacy when the US ignored the UN Security Council and then went back to it, and the Russians and the Chinese in those days were prepared to play along. They're not prepared to do that anymore.
AZ Mary, what do you think about Russia building Moscow suburb for U.S. Western conservatives to move to? Officially 200 families, but rumor is the wait list is 2 million. Wow.
Well, wow.
I've heard about this story.
well,
I don't know. Is it true,
yeah.
guys? I mean, I don't know.
I've heard about it. I've never seen any confirmation of it.
Raphael says, Brian, Ukraine lost a whole army, bro. After Gettysburg, the South knew the war was over. 500,000 men disappeared, and Ukraine will win what?
I think they've lost more than one whole army. I think they've lost two, going to be three now. And I mean, I don't disagree. They're not going to win anything. They're destroying their nation as part of a proxy war waged by the U.S. against Russia.
Peter Jackson says, about the RAF leaked messages regarding loads of useless white male pilots. Is this legitimate, or is it overt discrimination for sinister purposes?
Well, if it is true, it is against the law. I mean, it is discrimination, and discrimination, as far as I know, is against the law. I don't know for certain that this is true. It seems astonishing. If it really were true, then I think the lunatics have indeed taken over the asylum.
Shriveling Gale says, for Alex, do you think if Ben Wallace was allowed to see the Ukraine offensive plan after the postcard debacle?
Oh, I'm sure he's seen the Ukrainian offensive plan. He's probably written it.
Let's see. Sparky says, now that Alexander mentions it, maybe Western fools are that foolish. We know that Biden is the most competent member of the administration. Is it possible that he's the only one holding them back?
I don't think so. I get the sense, on the contrary, that he's very emotionally and viscerally invested in this. I think he also has a massive animus against Putin personally, which also affects a lot of what he does. So I don't think he's a restraining force. There are people in the US military and political and security leadership who I think are very skeptical about this Ukraine adventure, but don't think these people are moderates, by the way, or even realists. I mean, the most prominent perspective I get when you listen to them is they're saying, why are we wasting our resources in this secondary theater when our main theater is China? So what they're saying is, let's not waste time with Russia. We got China to go after instead. So there is that debate, but I don't think Biden is any force for restraint. I never got that impression.
From Rockfin, Dave says, question from here would be, how has shipping in the Mediterranean Sea changed in this last period? Routes, condition of ports, what is being shipped, directions and trade?
I'm not able to give you details. I mean, this is an impossible thing. Once upon a time, 20 years ago, I might have been able to, because I was involved in that world, but I'm not any longer. Now, all I can tell you is this. There's been lots of good articles about this. A recent one on oilprice.com. China and India are buying Russian oil at enormous amounts now. and they're making it into diesel oil and other kinds of oil, and it's heading westwards. Much of it is going to Europe, and this is universally known. And the Europeans pretend that they're trying to stop this trade, but of course they're not. And the oil price caps have collapsed, and to all intents and purposes. And that's the reality. And this is going to change the whole structure of shipping, the whole way in which shipping operates and performs. Anybody with any experience of the industry would have known in advance that that would happen. This is one of the most fleet-footed, flexible industries in the world, if you're talking about international shipping. And the people who run it are, believe me, some of the toughest, most unsentimental, and most, effective, if I could put it like that, business people you will find.
Controlled Demolition says Lindsay and Zelensky both had puffy eyes at their meeting. I think they are killing generations of men because they sell the women.
Well, I'm not going to go down that.
Mr. Tommy says, good afternoon from Belgium. You're three great guys. Commando Crossfire says, one of the results of the war is the rehabilitation of Nazism in the West. People at first supported it without knowing. Now they don't care. Next, they are. It's basically what Brian,
we
were saying. Yeah, they've accepted it.
Yeah.
Torsten says, when will Russia and China start proxy wars against NATO, Stan? Thinking of Syria and Iraq.
I don't think they will do that, because I don't think that's their modus operandi. I think proxy wars are incredibly destructive to the countries that get caught up in them. And I think at the moment, what the Russians and the Chinese want to do, you might be cynical about this. You might say they're doing it because it's in their own interests. But for whatever reason, what they're seeking to do is not wage proxy wars, is to build commercial and economic and ultimately political alliances, or I say alliances, I mean structures. And I think that's their purpose, that's their objective. Now, if the United States gets sucked into some kind of conflict somewhere, well, quite possibly, quite plausibly, the Russians at that point will get some payback by sending supplies to whoever it is that the US is fighting. But as I said, I don't think that's what the Russians and the Chinese are looking to do.
Summer of 1970 says, damn, 6 Pacific time. I need coffee. Thanks, Duran. From Rumble, Brian, why does Russia not have the same general ideal about intellectual property that China does? They are not held to account for IP theft.
I don't know. I mean, intellectual property is a tough topic. I personally, I am an industrial designer by trade. I really have no use for intellectual property. I've designed many things and put it out open source. Open source is a viable business model. People make millions off of it. And I think there's many different approaches. And I don't know how committed China really is. I think a lot of that is just to try to address the fabricated concerns the U.S. has that they use to smear China. I think a lot of that is in response to that, not out of general concern. And I think Russia also doesn't see it as a practical matter. Intellectual property is a way for a nation and corporations, a small handful of corporations, to monopolize everything. This is what the West is all about. People who are more interested in cooperation and just building things are not going to be as hung up. And not to say that it will not be an issue, but they're not going to be as hung up on it as say, the U.S. and many European countries are.
He said, just, do we think it is more likely that BRICS Plus will introduce new members one at a time, or can we expect them to go for the current 5 to 25 overnight with announcement when the time comes?
I think they will do it step by step. I don't think we're going to see a big explosion. I think that would make the BRICS an unworkable institution at this time. Remember, it started essentially as a club. It was just leaders of first 3 countries and then 4 countries, and then it became 5 countries meeting. And the institutional structures behind it were very small, and they still are to a great extent. So I think they will want it to grow as the institutional setup behind it evolves and develops as well.
KXL says China is using infrastructure and goodwill to change heart and mind of everyday people. More tangible, long-lasting than using media narratives. China thinks long term.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Brian?
Yes, I mean, I've seen it personally. I've been to Laos many times. I traveled from Kunming to Vientiane, the capital on the border with Thailand. It was a 3-day trip through winding, dangerous mountain roads. China came in, built a highway, cut it down to 24 hours. And now they've got a high-speed train that cuts it down to a couple of hours. And this has tangibly improved the lives of the people living there. You could just go to Vientiane. Over the years, you can see it improving. It's not because of Western NGOs driving their SUVs through the streets and hanging up banners telling locals not to use electricity. It certainly isn't because of that. And this is surely it's in the best interest of China. They get to do more business with more people by doing this. But as a result, they're also improving the lives of everyone else. And if you look at just Chinese society or Russian society, unity and purpose and building a tangible future, you could see the result versus the West, which divides their own people and works in intangibles. It's night and day. I mean, people can see it and judge for themselves.
Toby Clear says, man must change or die. There is no other course. The world teacher, a.k.a. Christ, Maitreya, Buddha, Iman, Maldi, Krishna, and Benjamin Cream. Golden Silence says, Alex, Alexander, and Brian, what a great stream. Matless X says, the West is teasing the idea of lifting sanctions on Russia if they freeze the conflict. Why would Russia care about the sanctions at this point?
Very good. Very good question.
Very true. Sparky, I'm going fishing this morning, so I leave you three in charge of the world while I'm gone. I trust that I'll find it better off than when I left it when I get back this afternoon.
Have a wonderful time fishing, yes.
Enjoy the fishing. Two Boomers says, hi, Alex. Great stream today. Thank you, Two Boomers. Stewart says, has Russia's economy diversified since 2022 to meet demand for products that are no longer available due to sanctions?
Well, the answer is yes. But this is, I think, one of those things that you always gets talked about. I mean, people talking about Russian economy needing to diversify. What they mean is diversify from oil and gas. They underestimate the extent to which the Russian economy is diversified already. I mean, we're not talking about a manufacturing industry on China's scale. Obviously not. But it's a pretty significant manufacturing power already, as I have seen.
Nigel Green says, where can I get the tracksuit top from Alexander? On the shop. It is on the shop, Nigel. A different one. It's a newer style, but it's on the shop. OG Val says, Dr. John Campbell has just done a video about the iodine because of the threat of the meltdown at the nuclear plant in Ukraine. Can we not stop the shelling?
Well,
who's we?
Who's we? Exactly.
Yeah, Ukraine needs to stop the shelling. Brian, the C in your name sounds like a ch.
Well, it's ordinarily it's Berletic, but the proper Croatian pronunciation is Berlech. So yeah, and my father's side of the family are all Slavic, and Russian was like the primary, but we have this Croatian surname. But I guess going through immigration 100 years ago in the U.S., it just was easier for them to say Berletic, which even people still can't get right.
Stewart says, was Iran excluded from the Azerbaijan-Armenia deal?
Well, if they were, they don't seem to be too bothered.
Duck Life says, Billy wanted to invade Iran and Trump stopped it.
I haven't heard of that, actually. Presumably this would have been at there were many crises, actually. But certainly, and this is the point to make about Trump, he didn't actually, I remember there was one instance when it looked as if the military situation was about to escalate, and he did act to stop it. So possibly.
Ideology says, Brian and Alex, you have not made a single comment in favor of Tate, not one. Rather, you attack him And an engineered
I-
way. I don't think anyone's
Yeah.
attacked.
Well, exactly.
No,
It
and I
was-
never said that he's an engineered way of splitting society. I said he's
Not at all.
participating in that. Doesn't even mean that he's doing it intentionally, but that's just that's his thing. That's what he does for his audiences. And it's just something that I don't get involved in, period, because I do geopolitical analysis. It's like asking an engineer why he's not painting pictures down at the art galleries, because that's not what he does.
Yes.
Yeah, no one's attacked anybody. Not at all. Not at all. It's just a matter of time. I mean, it's.
I don't even have time to sleep.
Yeah, it's just us. I mean, we don't have big teams around us to cover all the news.
Every
or
topic.
Every topic. It's
Exactly.
It's a time issue.
Yeah.
Commando Crossfire says Moscow and Beijing competing for best, biggest metro.
Well, I haven't seen the metro in Beijing, but if it's going to compete with the Moscow metro, then it would have to be extremely good indeed.
Let's see. Latimer says, hi, the Duran team. And Brian, a quick question. What do you think about the new development in the U.S. Congress and its attempt to establish a tribunal against Putin? Yes, Brian Alexander, the latest tribunal against Putin from Congress.
Yeah, I mean,
I haven't heard of it, actually. Alexander?
A tribunal.
It's a tribunal. The U.S. the Congress has no jurisdiction to establish a tribunal over the head of state of another country, and I mean, but that won't prevent them doing it. I don't think Putin is particularly impressed or particularly concerned.
Yeah. Elia says, thanks to all of you, Finnish mainstream media has nothing but lies, so I listen to you every day.
I've heard a lot of people in Finland say this.
Mehdi, why do people not understand if the U.S. goes to war with China, it is not just the Chinese Navy U.S. carrier groups will be facing, but most of its entire Air Force and Homeland Defense systems in range?
Yeah, what a lot of people don't understand are, because of the way the Western media portrays this, is that the U.S. has to cross an entire ocean to pick this fight with China. China has a military geared specifically to the defense of China and China alone, and more specifically, they are laser focused on Taiwan. This has been an issue for decades that they see as a problem that needs to be solved. So when the U.S. picks a fight with China, they will be doing it where China is right next to their industrial base, right next to their shores, right next to their integrated air defense system, and everything else that they've been setting up over decades. And the U.S. has to cross an entire ocean to resupply. Very problematic.
Rafiq Adams says, what do you think will finally end the neoconservative grip on U.S. foreign policy? Dollar collapse, BRICS, coalition, military coup, U.S., all of the above?
A decision by the American people to basically push these people out of the halls of power. Now, how that's going to be done, I don't know, and it may be very difficult. It might not even be possible. But don't look for external causes. Dollar collapse in itself doesn't mean that the people who control foreign policy are going to change. If I could give an example, I mean, in the 17th century, Spain lost its power. But it doesn't mean that the people who were running Spanish foreign policy before lost control. When Britain's imperial power ended, that didn't mean in itself that the whole, social and political grouping that controlled British foreign policy up to that time lost power. So you have to do it within the United States, and I hope not through a military coup.
It's a really good point.
Sparky says, Chinese spies are long a part of the landscape of America. They work as professionals, go to school as students. They're part of America, part of its economy, but the U.S. is worried about Taiwan.
Well, maybe, but all I can just say, I mean, there's spies in every country from every country. I mean, I'm sure that is true. I mean, I understand your point, but I think that this issue also perhaps is a bit overstated.
I don't think the U.S. is worried about Taiwan at all, except for what value they get out of using it as a proxy against the rest of China, just like they are not worried about Ukraine, you can clearly see, demonstratively so, they don't care about Ukraine or its people.
Brent says Hungarian leadership appears to be supportive of Serbia. At the same time, Hungarian peacekeepers are involved in the clashes in Kosovo. What's the game here for Hungary? Afoot in both camps.
No, I think this is a legacy. I mean, Hungary used to be in good standing with NATO and all the other institutions, and they were involved in all these peacekeeping things. Now, of course, they're not in good standing anymore, but there's all kinds of things left over from that time, and this is one of them.
Matt Lisek says, about Russia population growth needs and American settlements in Russia. George Galloway recently said he heard that 2 million Germans have moved to Russia since the SMO. 2 million?
No, I'm sure he's wrong. I haven't heard anything like that. And I'm sure that is a huge overstatement.
Why Russia is not using the U.S. tactic in Syria? Why Russia is not getting Syria cruise missiles to bomb U.S. bases?
Well, because Syria has stabilized without it. I mean, Brian, you want to add something? I mean,
well, that's a good point, and it's because they don't want to wage a direct war with the United States. That would be playing into what the U.S. had been trying to provoke the entire time they were involved in Syria. They wanted to get in a direct military intervention in Syria, more directly than occupying eastern Syria. And like you said, Alexander, they're able to do this without a direct confrontation. And they can use proxies, which is much safer, more sustainable over time, and much more difficult for the U.S. to combat. So that is why that they would not do that.
Sparky says, last super chat sent from my bass boat, by the way. Awesome, Sparky. Enjoy. Thank you for that. Jorge Marin, keep up the good work. What will it take for Ukraine to plead for negotiations?
I'm not sure that this government in Ukraine is capable. Yeah, a new government, basically. Yeah.
Sticky Mark says, God bless you. Thank you. And free Assange. And sadly now, Gonzalo, remember the names or we are all lost. Prayers for them and for all of us every day.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for that. Moondragon, what is going on with the Siberia Pipeline 2?
This is the one to China, and of course the I don't know about this the US, but the Financial Times is making a huge play about the fact that all the contracts haven't yet been signed, and Xi Jinping and Putin didn't confirm it was going forward when Xi Jinping came to Moscow, and it wasn't confirmed when Mishustin went to Beijing, and this proves that all these summit meetings were failures and all of these things. This is a gigantic project. Sorting all the various component parts is going to take a time. They will get there. It will happen.
Two Boomers says, Prigozhin said Russia needs Stalin-style purges of its officer corps, political class.
Yes, as I said, I mean, I think he's gone completely off the rails, actually, and for quite a long time now. I don't, by the way, buy this view. You still see people say that this is all some kind of cunning Maskirovka operation. I don't think this is my own personal view. I don't think this is the case. I think that Prigozhin is making these statements. I don't think many people in Russia take them very seriously. And I think the one thing we learned from the battle in Bakhmut is that he is not actually the person in operational control of the Wagner forces. He said he was pulling them out in 5 days, and of course they remained and won.
What are your thoughts, Brian, on all of that with Prigozhin and Bakhmut?
I keep an open mind to all of the possibilities, but I do lean in the direction toward what you and Alexander have been saying, that he probably is losing his mind. He's not really a military commander. He's a polarizing figure. He gets a lot of attention when he does this. When he doesn't do it, nobody pays him any minds. And so it could be. I mean, it's not as if Russia is the master manipulator and has absolutely everything under control. And I think people should keep that in mind. They don't, including people like Prigozhin or Streklov, who's always, the Western media loves these people because they can always go to them and show that there's all of these cracks, when in reality, I don't think that they're cracks. But if there was some sort of psychological operation, it is a perfect way to manage it and keep the West hooked on these manufactured crises rather than digging in and finding real ones.
Yeah, very true.
We'll find out sooner or later what the truth is. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Why did North Korea never get a deal like the JCPOA?
You see, this is the fundamental point, because it did get a deal very like the JCPOA, directly negotiated with the United States during the time of the Clinton administration. And the deal was that North Korea would stop its nuclear enrichment programs and would not pursue nuclear weapons development. And in return, the United States would supply North Korea with pressurized water reactors, and there would be sanctions lifted and all those things. And what happened is exactly the same thing that happened with the JCPOA. The US reneged on all of those commitments. It started to impose more sanctions on North Korea, and the North Koreans decided, in light of that, there was no point in wasting time with further negotiations. They might as well go forward and develop nuclear weapons themselves. The story of US diplomacy with North Korea is an extraordinary one. It is of the US making promises which it didn't fulfill, confident always that the North Korean regime was about to collapse, and astounded when it didn't, and appalled when in fact it did develop nuclear weapons, which at one time the US thought it never would.
And if I can add the Iran nuclear deal, if people look at the Brookings Institution's 2009 document called Which Path to Persia, they spelled it out explicitly. They will make a deal with Iran. It will be a great deal. Iran couldn't refuse it unless they were intent on developing nuclear weapons. And essentially, the U.S. would sabotage this themselves deliberately to paint a target on Iran, to make it look like internationally the U.S. tried, and it was the Iranians determined to develop nuclear weapons for all the wrong purposes. They spelled it out, and then they literally implemented it step by step, from the Obama administration to the Trump administration to the Biden administration. Continuity of agenda.
Chris says, greetings from Cyprus. The war will end with the liberation of Odessa. Ura.
Possibly.
Thank you, Chris, for that. Rubia says, Brian, what's the new Thai government like in relations with China?
Well, they're outright anti-China. The de facto leader, billionaire Thanaton Juangroongruangket, he vowed to cancel the high-speed rail project instead for the Hyperloop, which doesn't even exist. And then over the last couple of years, he's been going up and down the route with these fake NGOs funded by the U.S. to stir up the locals, to lodge legal complaints to delay the construction. It's already under construction. During the pandemic, they had people out in the streets protesting against Sinovac, demanding that the government buy Pfizer and Moderna. I mean, very transparently anti-China, pro-US, without a doubt. And now they've vowed openly that they're going to pivot away from China, their largest economic partner, back to the West, which offers the region absolutely nothing, and specifically to cooperate with implementing the U.S. Congress Burma Act to fuel an armed conflict in neighboring Myanmar. So I hope that gives an impression of who they are and what they represent.
Commando Crossfire says the U.S. is threatening Uganda for passing anti-LGBT laws, which are supported by 95% of the population. U.S. threatening, guess what? Sanctions.
Yep, surprised.
John Matthew says, did Africa and Asian countries really get freedom?
No. I mean, they've had. I mean, first of all, they weren't given freedom. They had to fight to end colonialism, and that's an important point to make clear. I mean, we talked about Indonesia earlier in the program. There was a big war in Indonesia. I mean, Sukarno had to fight a war to drive the Dutch out. It wasn't, simply the Dutch coming along and giving independence to Indonesia. So they had to fight to achieve that. But of course, the fight to get full independence, sovereignty, is a much, much longer struggle, and it's nowhere near concluded.
Cooper says, I'm truly honored to see the three of my favorites. Thank you for all you do. I've learned so much. My wife teases me and says, enjoying your daily walk with Alex. Thank you, Cooper, for that. Luca says, West is now attempting to weaponize the fact that minorities are still alive and thriving in Russia and China, calling it decolonization.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has been it's a very good point. It's a very good point about, actually, by the way.
Duran and Brian doing pretty good job. Wish you all the best. Kosovo, yeah, Serbia. Kosovo, yes, Serbia.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. No sense says, Brian, top-notch channel. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Controlled Demolition. I bought Colonel McGregor's book, Margin of Victory, and 3 books from Scott Ritter regarding disarmament in Russia, Ukraine.
Good for you.
Thank you for that. Breaking up Russia is code for putting them on reservations. Same tactics used on the Donbass. That's what.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think to say about Russia is, of course, 80% of the population of Russia are ethnic Russian-speaking Slavs. In other words, Russians. So, I mean, this talk about breaking up Russia, it's not something that you can naturally do. If you're going to do it, you have to force it on the people to do that. And of course, many of the people who are not ethnic Russians, in fact, the vast majority of them, still identify overwhelmingly as Russians. So it's a decolonization, that so-called, which the colonized, the supposed colonized, absolutely do not want.
Toby Clear says, Maitreya is the secret name of the 5th Buddha and the Kalki avatar, the last Messiah who will come at the culmination of the great cycle. HPB.
You're clearly somebody who is well versed in the Buddhist classics.
No sense says, Prigozhin sounds scared, stepped on too many toes.
Well, quite possibly. I mean, I haven't followed him very closely, I have to say, since the Bakhmut battle ended. I think that people give him too much attention, actually.
Etu Brutus says, I heard the same thing about the 2 million Germans in Russia, but it was more the context of people in Germany applying to immigrate.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. Well, applying is a big difference from actually immigrating. Yeah. Sparky says, Chinese spies aren't so much cloak and dagger as they are correspondents gauging the feel of the U.S. Most of their time is with their jobs and studies.
In which case, are they really spies? I mean, just asking. I mean, they might be people who are there providing information, but are they engaged in actual espionage? Just asking.
Lindy the African says, question to all of you. What's the worst part of your job?
The worst part
Brian
of my
Alexander.
job? That's a very good question, actually. I mean, it's a very hard work. I mean, we have to spend many hours on this. And I suppose not giving as much time to my family as I would like is certainly an issue.
Brian,
and I personally, I don't want to do this. I don't like doing this. I do it because, especially regarding Southeast Asia, no one else is really doing it. If someone came along who could do it as good or better, I would easily just give up. I loved doing industrial design. I loved working on open source projects. I mean, that was a passion, something I loved doing.
Yeah.
This just paints a huge target on me. I'm in a country that will have a U.S. client regime most likely in power. It will be very disruptive. And as Alexander said, I have a family. I have children. I love spending time with them. Luckily, I do. I work at home doing this, which is good.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like Alexander says, people, I don't think they understand how much time you got. Like when I talk about Which Path to Persia, it means I had to read it cover to cover. It's not fun to read these documents that they put out. So yeah, it is. It's very taxing. It's very little appealing about it. Only the fact that so many people seem to appreciate and benefit from it, that's the thing that kind of keeps me going.
Absolutely, I have to say, reading these materials is absolutely soul destroying. And I don't know whether,
Yes.
Brian, you found the same experience, but the sheer cynicism that you find in these documents is really quite shattering. Between themselves, with each other, they're quite open about what they tend to do.
Absolutely. I highly recommend that ordinary people go. These documents are public, and they just rely on the average person not knowing or caring enough too bored to read 300 pages about, you know, how China's inferior. We have to destroy them, make it look like they're the aggressors. Like you say, Alexander, they're very open about this. With Iran, they were very, very open about proposing the deal, deliberately sabotaging it, then blaming Iran and using that as a pretext for war. To replicate everything they did in Iraq that was illegal and inhumane and a monstrous war crime. It's soul destroying. Absolutely.
Yeah. They don't hide their hate, to be quite honest. That's why when we talked about like the Lindsey Graham thing, when Lindsey Graham says stuff like that, it's not for him. He's fine with it. You know, it's something that's been documented in what he said or written for many, many years. He's saying stuff like Russians are dying doesn't really bother him.
No.
You know, it's.
If you saw him with Al Qaeda in Syria and Libya, then I mean, like, this is quite tame actually by comparison.
Exactly. Yeah. Marco says, given the Donbass crisis is still ongoing, may I recommend a vast multi-part series that was recently concluded on YT. Orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, the entire arc of Greek and Russian history from the Bronze Age until 1923.
Yeah, I mean, where to find the time to watch these vast programs? But you know, it is an interesting thing. By the way, the expression, you know, nationality, orthodoxy, and autocracy comes from something from. It was a slogan developed by the Russian education minister, a man called Count Uvarov, in the 1830s. And it was, for a time, it was the sort of program, the educational program of the Tsarist government in Russia. It was their sort of ideological idea, if you like.
Sparky says, to be clear, as a U.S. citizen, I don't feel any more threatened by China than I do Ukraine. Best thing to do with China is to deal and trade, in my opinion.
Completely agree.
Well said. David says Saudi set to join BRICS New Development Bank.
Well, that is very big news, because of course eventually, if they are going to launch a new currency, a new reserve currency, and one presumes they are, then being able to trade in oil with that currency is going to be an absolutely essential linchpin to making it an effective reserve currency.
Yeah. I just lost that question. Where was it? Why the EU is a vassal, especially Germany?
Huge question. I mean, lots of unanswered explanations there. And it's something that developed gradually over the course of, you know, European history post-Second World War. And then suddenly, around about the year 2000, it all seemed to come together. And we are where we are. I mean, you know, we can spend a lot of time looking for explanations. Perhaps the more useful thing at the moment to do is to recognize that that is what it is and to confront it.
Marian says, has anyone heard news about Gonzalo Lira?
Not since his arrest, and not since the Ukrainians said what they were going to charge him with, which I find, I mean, I want to make it very clear. I mean, I don't understand these charges from a legal point of view. I mean, they don't make any kind of sense to me. But anyway, there we go. They're charging him. What is the ominous thing is that I get the sense that the US, the State Department, is washing its hands of him, even though he's a US citizen.
Yes, and there was a press conference, and a U.S. representative was asked about Gonzalo point blank, and they just said, "We know about it." And they said, "Well, are you doing anything about it?" He said, "Well, we know about it." Which, if it was someone arrested by Russia, you would never hear the end of it. How he needs to be released, and this is a miscarriage of justice. People will pay, but in this case, yes, they're just going to ignore it. Unfortunately.
Brian, Alexander, the right course of action, would it not just be for the Ukraine government, for the U.S. government, which controls the Ukraine government, but for them to just have Gonzalo deported? Would that not be the right course of action? The government doesn't like what he says. Zelensky doesn't like what he says. Just send him out of the country. And
Absolutely, expel him. Expel him.
I think this is about regular. I think this is more about making an example out of him. I mean, this is what the whole Ukraine operation is about. It's about violence. It's about terrorism. It's about getting Russia into line. It's about getting everyone else into line. That's what it's all about, is control. And I think this was meant as part of that, to scare people, intimidate them, encourage them to stay quiet.
Summer of 1970 says, what will happen first? Hell freezing over, or the Bank of England giving Venezuela's gold back?
Hell freezing over. Isn't that obvious?
Raphael says, Brian, I worked in a G3 second FSSG. Bro, can you please explain to me, where are we going to park all of these boats and subs to fight China? Educate me.
I mean, this is what I was saying. I mean, the idea of the U.S. waging some sort of successful war against China across the entire ocean, it's implausible. They're not going to be able to do it. If you read these think tanks, when they analyze this or do war games about fighting China, they're claiming that it's somehow a victory, but when you read it, it's obviously a defeat for the United States. And at the end of it, China will still be in a stronger position than the United States. So, yeah, I agree that this is implausible. They're out of time, and they should just face reality. But of course, we know that they're not going to do that.
Yes. Rafik Adams says, for Brian, do you think Nord Stream 2 will ever be repaired and German relations with Russia restored? What would it take? New government, likely?
I think it would require the collapse of the U.S. in its current state as a global hegemon. It would require all of Europe getting out from under the shadow of U.S. hegemony that has been cast over the continent since the end of World War II. And yes, a new government in Germany. And I think that Russia has deliberately made decisions not to burn bridges for the long term. They want someday down the road to do business with Europe and even the United States. Same goes for China, but I think they're quite okay with, in the meantime, doing without it.
Mm-hmm. Jerry says, you three gentlemen have more common sense and intelligence than all the Western governments combined. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Greg says, I contacted my congresswoman to free Gonzalo Lira. Appreciate all of your hard work and dedication.
I know a lot of people in our community have done so, and I'd like to say thank you for doing that.
Yes. Tabernacle says, chickens are harmless, yet much noisier than eagles. Mm. Well said. I suggest it says, I've been seeing Western media gas up Thailand's new president. He's even been getting interviews. Does the U.S. intend to pit Thailand against China?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, it's Prime Minister. But yes, that just when you see the BBC singing his praises, CNN getting him on, he's speaking almost perfect English. He has a Harvard. I mean, like, these are all red flags that should go off immediately. And if you've been following this closely, like I have, and laying out all of the evidence of U.S. interference, it's very clear that had always been the plan. And that is the plan the U.S. has with every nation along China's periphery, to turn them against China, just as they turned Europe against Russia.
Imra says, thank you all three reading those terrible documents so we don't have to.
Yeah.
Okay, Imra. Marcos says, Brian, thanks for the hugely informative work you do regarding the Donbass conflict. There's much smoke and mirrors, very little truth and rationality.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Panel, good book, Guilt by Association by U.S. lawyer Jeff Gates, 2008, coined term multi-generational criminal syndicate and effective use of game theory to recruit, and manipulate agents of influence.
Okay.
Tom says, I want to add that I feel a great deal of empathy for you folks and work you do, especially with families. I know it's immensely time consuming and needs exhaustive review, fact checking. Geopolitics is not easy.
No.
Thank you, Tom, for that. Brucholo, okay, says, if the US dollar stops being the reserve currency, how will the US fund all of its expensive military projects?
It won't be able to. That's the whole point about it. I mean, it won't just. I mean, it will have to live within its means, and that will be something the US will find very difficult to do.
Sparky says, perhaps the Chilean government will step up for Gonzalo.
Well, apparently they are, but of course Chile doesn't have much influence in Kiev. The US does, and he's an American citizen.
Peter says, Germany became a US vassal through the transatlantic think tanks educating journalists. There is one show, Die Anstalt, which summarizes the structure. DZ tried to stop them via court.
Oh, interesting. Okay, thanks for that. Yeah.
Jahagar says, with all the wars ever reached the lands of the actual perpetrators, I believe then there will be real peace. Also, shouldn't some countries pull their heads out of the USA's ...
Well, I don't want to see war spread. I mean, I think that would be a disaster. And I think, and I repeat this again, you're talking about neocons. These people have no reverse gear. I want to say this. If we expand wars to the extent that they start to reach, say, the United States, they won't rethink their strategies. They will simply escalate even further in response. The way to do this is not to sort of combat them in that way. It's to follow the course that you set in your second part of your question. Think about what they're doing and build structures that can contain them. And that, it seems to me, is what the Russians and the Chinese, as Brian said earlier, are trying to do.
Finboy Slick says, Brian, the only sustainable way to counter China is to have a society based on freedom that wins people over. You can't do it with force and deception.
Yeah.
I mean, go to China. The people there are pretty free and enjoying I think they're enjoying their lives much more than many Americans are at this point. People really got to question narratives. They know they're being lied to about Ukraine, and yet they'll repeat verbatim talking points put out by the U.S. State Department regarding China, and they really need to reflect on why they're doing that. It's part of human nature, but we really have to reflect on that, because that is how they perpetuate all of this, by not selling you everything, but at least part of the agenda, so you're holding at least part of it up, and everyone is going to help move it along.
Yeah.
Finboy Slick says, thoughts on Zimbabwe's gold-backed currency project could actually sound money come out of our current geopolitical rearrangement.
I suspect, I mean, I'm not fully up to date with this, that it is primarily about trying to stabilize the financial situation in Zimbabwe itself, which has been bad for decades. So, creating a gold-backed currency might be an idea to try to do that and bring to a stop this raging inflation that has affected the country for so long. So I think that's probably more what it's all about than trying to create an alternative, if you like. I mean, Zimbabwe by itself doesn't have the resources to do that.
Raphael says Biden's own secretary defected to Russia with all the knowledge with her, but there is nothing to see. Are we serious? The U.S. is not serious.
Mm-hmm.
Costa says the strongest Russian weapon is West arrogance. You can quote me.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think I discussed again in a recent program this extraordinary exchange between Joe Biden and Erdogan just after Erdogan got re-election. I mean, Erdogan had fought a very difficult election. He was tired and exhausted. He must have felt elated when he got the result. I mean, he's a human being after all, whatever you may think of him. And I mean, the criticisms I could make of Erdogan would fill a book. I don't particularly even like the man. But anyway, that's how he must have felt. So he gets a call from Biden, supposedly to congratulate him. And as soon as he picks up the phone, Biden is talking about NATO, about Vilnius, about Turkey must follow, the American lead, must adjust its policies on regional issues, must agree to admit Sweden into NATO, must perhaps even agreed to a roadmap for Ukraine. He was just talking like this to Erdogan at the moment when Erdogan, I'm sure, really wasn't receptive, probably wouldn't have ever been receptive to this. But it was such a bad moment to do it. And if you look at the Turkish readout of that call, it's about a couple of lines long. It's just utterly terse. There was clearly a furious row, and Erdogan must have gone away absolutely livid.
Andres Brezin says, remember, Hitler was Time Magazine's Man of the Year, so was Dr. F. Eurogabor says, we men can agree that good body parts should be kept always well moisturized. Donation towards Alexander's hands. Okay. Thank you for that. And a couple of more, and we'll wrap up. AD says, do Russias have the use of SAR capability, like the J-Star, for example?
Brian, you know probably much more about this than me. In fact, I mean, I don't know anything about this.
Yeah, I think that because J-Star is like U.S. surveillance. I think they're talking about synthetic aperture radar, and if that's the case, then yes, Russia and China both have these capabilities. And in some cases, the U.S. admits that they're a little bit ahead of the U.S. in their own technology, especially China.
And Cheddar Spinner says, not sure if you treated my question about Nigerian drug lord presidents.
Well,
Yes,
we answered it
We
to the
tried
extent
to.
that we had to admit. We had to admit that we just don't know
Yeah.
enough about this
Yeah.
to be able to answer it properly. So apologies for that.
All right. So, gentlemen, I said an hour and 15 minutes. Thank you very, very much, Brian. I apologize that
No worries.
that
at
I was
all.
so off
it's
on my
always a
timing.
pleasure.
Thank you for sticking around with us, and I'm sure everyone in the live stream was very happy that you stuck around and answered everyone's question.
Absolutely.
Questions.
Well, we're very grateful, very generous in your in giving
Very
us so much of your
generous.
time.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
Thank you. And,
Thank you for having me, as always.
Yes, and then let's organize another live stream with a focused topic, maybe in the next week or two. That would be great to have you back with us. This was more of a casual Q&A session, and boy, did we answer a lot of questions. Thank you, everybody, for all your questions. There's a lot going on in the world, that's for sure, but I think we covered a lot of areas. Ray L says Brian rocks. Yes, he does.
He does.
Thank you, Brian Berletic from the New Atlas. I will put a link to Brian's channel down below and as a pinned comment as well. Thank you, Alexander Mercuris. Thank you to our moderators, Zariel, Alan, Peter, Valies, Reckless Abandon. I hope I'm not missing anybody. Alan Watson, William Justice. Thank you guys for helping us out and for everything that you do to our moderators. And thank you for everyone who watched us on Locals, the Duran.locals.com, Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, and Telegram. Any final thoughts, guys, before we sign off? It's been 3 hours. 3 hours and 1 minute.
It's been 3 hours. And can I just say, I mean, again, it's wonderful to have Brian, and there's been an awful lot going on over the next couple of weeks. We'll see whether this offensive, how it materializes. I'm sure it will come, by the way, at some form, and we'll see what happens. And of course, lots happening all sorts of other places too.
Yes, and just again, thank you for having me on. It's always an honor and a pleasure. And also thank you both for the work that you do. I know I benefit greatly from it. As I explained in the beginning,
we likewise.
Yes, and it's just great. It's because I remember a time where there weren't that many people out there doing what we do, and it's great that this community has grown the way that it has. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you again, Brian, for sticking with us for this live stream and answering everyone's questions. Take care.
Take care.